Section 1. The World Before the Griffins Existed. There is a version of Family Guy that nobody ever watched. Not because it was deliberately hidden, not because it was locked away in a network vault somewhere under a Fox executive's desk with a combination that nobody alive could crack. The hiding was more ordinary than that, more quiet, more human. It was hidden inside time itself. Inside the years before the show had a name, before any of the characters had the faces you would eventually recognize, before the theme song existed or the fictional Rhode Island town had been sketched on any map by any hand. There was a young man sitting alone in his kitchen somewhere in Los Angeles, drawing pictures in the small hours of the morning, trying to bring something to life that hadn't existed yet. And the things he was building in those early months, the ideas he was laying down on paper, the voices he was experimenting with alone in an empty apartment at 2 in the morning, those things were the original version of the show. The raw, unpolished, unaired, uncompromised version of a story that would eventually reach over 22 million people on its very first night. What you are going to hear tonight is that version, the one that got lost, the one that changed before it ever aired. The story of the characters who were designed and then redesigned, the plots that were written and then quietly shelved, the voice actors who showed up and then gradually disappeared, the entire creative vision of one of the most influential animated comedies in television history, before the network executives got hold of it, before the institutional pressures of commercial television reshaped it, before 25 years of compromise and evolution and writing room turnover turned it into something its creator might barely recognize if he sat down to watch it fresh. This is not a ghost story, but it does involve things that vanished. Things that were present once and then absent, in the way that some of the most important things go absent, not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece, over years, so gradually that you almost don't notice until the day you look up and the thing you loved isn't quite there anymore. Tonight, in whatever quiet corner of the world you have found yourself in, whether it is genuinely late and the room is dark and you want something to ease you towards sleep, or whether you are somewhere mid-afternoon with rain against a window and nowhere particular you need to be tonight, is a good night to go looking for the Family Guy that never got made. Let us go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the show, the beginning of the man who made it. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on the 26th of October, 1973, in a small town in Connecticut called Kent, the kind of place where autumn arrives with real commitment, where the trees go orange and gold in a way that feels almost performative, where the air smells like wood smoke weeks before Halloween. He was, by most accounts, a quiet and peculiar kid in the specific and admirable way that the most creatively driven people often are when they are young. By the time he was 2 years old, too, he was already drawing cartoons. Not in the vague scribbling sense that leads adults to stick refrigerator drawings under magnets and call every child a born artist. He was drawing recognizable characters from the animated shows he watched. Woody Woodpecker, Fred Flintstone. By the time he was 8, he had designed and was writing a self-created comic strip called Walter Crouton that his local Connecticut newspaper was actually publishing. A published cartoonist at age 8. The kid was already doing the work in a professional sense before he was old enough to fully understand that the work was work. He grew up watching the same cartoons that most American children of the late 1970s and early 1980s grew up watching. But where most children absorbed those shows passively, Seth was watching analytically. He was studying. He would watch a Hanna-Barbera production and find himself noticing the rhythm of the jokes, the way the background music changed subtly in the seconds before a punchline landed, the specific physical timing of a comedic reaction from a character. He was absorbing not just what he was watching, but the mechanism behind it. The visible craft hidden inside what looked like effortless entertainment. Later, when he was older and talking in interviews about the influences on his work, he would name Jackie Gleason, and the specific quality of Gleason's Ralph Kramden character from The Honeymooners, the working-class bombast, the lovable, self-defeating overconfidence. The specific way that Kramden's plans always unraveled and always led him back to the genuine love underneath the bluster. He would reference All in the Family, the archetypal story of a loving but oafish patriarch who meant well and got things wrong constantly, and was fundamentally decent underneath all the noise. He would talk about the Hanna-Barbera house style, that warm and specific feeling of hand-drawn American animation that a generation of children recognized as the visual language of Saturday mornings. He went to the Kent School in Connecticut for his high school years, and he was already working seriously by then, sketching, developing characters, refining his comedic instincts. He enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design in the early 1990s, a place that is considered one of the finest art and design schools in the United States. RISD, pronounced RISD by everyone who has been there, is not the kind of school where coasting is possible. It expects you to develop a genuine perspective, a genuine point of view, not just technical competence. And the rigorous quality of that expectation is visible in the work McFarlane produced there, because his student work wasn't merely competent. It contained an entire universe that was already almost completely formed. He studied film, video, and animation. He worked constantly. He spent those college years developing his drawing with the discipline that serious art school training requires, honing his voice acting abilities in private in his dormitory room and then his apartment, building his theoretical understanding of how comedy operates at a structural level. He experimented with stand-up comedy during this period too, because if you are going to be Seth MacFarlane, you apparently feel that doing several difficult creative things simultaneously is the natural way to spend your early 20s. The single most consequential thing that happened during his time at RISD was a project he completed in 1995, in his senior year. It was his thesis film, the capstone project required of all graduating students. For most graduating art and design students, the thesis film is the thing you make to satisfy the graduation requirement, demonstrate that you have absorbed the school's technical teachings, and then set aside as you move into the professional world. Seth's thesis film became the genetic blueprint for one of the longest-running animated comedy series in American television history. He called it The Life of Larry. From a technical standpoint, it is a rough piece of work. The animation has the particular quality of something made by a talented person who was still in the process of fully becoming what they were going to become. The timing is not always perfect. The drawings have an unfinished quality in places. The production values reflect the fact that this was a student project made on a student's budget with a student's resources. But none of that matters when you watch it, because what you are looking at is a complete and coherent comedic universe that already exists in fully recognizable form. There is a man named Larry. He is balding and overweight and middle-aged and not especially intellectually gifted. He means well. He is lovable in an undignified way that makes you want to see things work out for him, even as you can already see that things are not about to work out for him. His wife is named Lois. His talking dog, Steve, is clearly the most intellectually capable being in any room he enters. The humor arrives in flashes, quick, unexpected cuts away from the main scene to illustrate a separate joke before returning you to where you were. The whole thing runs about 11 minutes and contains within it the entire DNA of what would become, eventually, one of the most watched animated programs in American television history. There is a specific detail about Larry's voice that deserves to be known, because it sits at the intersection of the ordinary and the extraordinary that constitutes the actual raw material of creative biography. Seth MacFarlane has discussed in interviews over the years that he based the voice he developed for Larry, the voice that would eventually become Peter Griffin's voice, on a security guard he had observed and listened to. During his time at RISD, a particular man, doing a particular job, walking the halls of an art school in Rhode Island with a specific accent and a particular way of carrying himself. Seth watched him, listened to him, filed away the vocal patterns, developed them into a comedic voice, and that security guard, who almost certainly never knew he was being studied, would eventually be the sonic template for one of the most recognized animated voices in the world. He is Peter Griffin's voice. He walked around a school in Rhode Island not knowing. He probably still doesn't know. After MacFarlane graduated in 1995, his professor made a decision that changed the course of animation history without anyone involved fully understanding that at the time. The professor submitted The Life of Larry to Hanna-Barbera Productions, the legendary animation studio that had created the Flintstones and Yogi Bear and Scooby-Doo and 100 other programs that constituted the visual furniture of American childhood. They watched what this 21-year-old kid from Connecticut had made in his senior year, and they offered him a job. He moved to Los Angeles. He was 21 years old, freshly graduated, heading toward a career he had been building toward since he could hold a pencil. His first years in professional animation were spent doing exactly what most young animators do, working in the machine, learning what professional production actually requires. He worked as a writer and storyboard artist on Johnny Bravo, the muscled, dim-witted Cartoon Network show. He worked on Cow and Chicken. He worked on Dexter's Laboratory, the brilliant show about a boy genius with a secret lab behind his bedroom bookshelf. He did freelance animation writing for Walt Disney Animation on Jungle Cubs. He contributed to I Am Weasel. He was, by all professional metrics, doing well. But in whatever time wasn't consumed by these professional obligations, he was working on a second version of the Larry material. In 1997, while he was working at Hanna-Barbera, he produced a short animated film called Larry and Steve, which was broadcast on Cartoon Network as part of their world premiere Toons showcase. That showcase was a remarkable initiative. Cartoon Network essentially served as a development platform for independent animators, giving them short production slots to make standalone cartoon films with minimal creative restriction. And Seth MacFarlane's entry was a refined version of the character dynamic that had been present in the thesis film focused specifically on Larry and the talking dog Steve, leaning fully into the specific comedy of an intellectually sophisticated dog navigating a world built primarily by and for humans who were not quite at his level. Fox Broadcasting Company executives saw both Larry shorts. The material landed in front of people at Fox who recognized something in it. They reached out to MacFarlane. They wanted him to develop a full animated series based on those characters. They would provide $50,000 for a pitch pilot. A pilot that would, if Fox liked it, serve as the basis for a complete series order. $50,000 sounds significant when you have it in your hand at 23 years old. For producing a professional animated television pilot, $50,000 is barely a beginning. The standard budget for a half-hour animated pilot at that time was somewhere in the range of $1 million. MacFarlane was being given 1/20th of the usual amount. The timeline was not generous. There was no extended development period, no sprawling pre-production phase. MacFarlane retreated to his apartment and got to work. He spent 6 months on that pilot. 6 months, by his own account given in a New York Times interview, of essentially no sleep and no social life. Just drawing in his kitchen, by hand, alone, doing voice after voice in the quiet of his own rooms, building something from $50,000 and 6 months and everything he had accumulated in the 20-odd years since he had been old enough to draw Woody Woodpecker on a sheet of paper. The experience he described was not romantic in the soft focus way that origin stories sometimes get told. It was hard and isolating and exhausting. He was doing something enormously difficult on a budget that was insufficient and a timeline that did not allow him to slow down. What came out of those 6 months was a 16-minute animated film that would be screened for Fox executives and result in the immediate ordering of a full series. That series would premiere on the 31st of January 1999, following Super Bowl 33, and it would pull in 22 million viewers on its very first night. But before any of that, before the order and the premiere and the 22 million viewers, there was just Seth MacFarlane in his apartment at night, drawing and redrawing things that would never quite make it onto the screen in exactly the forms he first imagined them. Characters with different faces. A family wearing different clothes. A world that was recognizably the right world but still in the process of becoming what it would eventually be. That is where we are starting tonight. With the version that got away, with the Family Guy that nobody, or almost nobody, ever watched. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from right now, and what time it is. I genuinely love seeing where these videos find people, and if you are not subscribed yet, it is completely free and it means a lot to this channel. Now let's keep going. Section 2. The Life of Larry, the DNA of an Empire. Before there was a Griffin family, there was a man named Larry. He existed first on paper, then on film, and then in the imaginations of the small handful of people who happened to see the student thesis film that Seth MacFarlane submitted as his senior project at the Rhode Island School of Design in 1995. He was not yet famous. He was not yet referenced in entertainment journalism. He was not yet the subject of retrospective analysis about the origins of one of the most successful animated franchises in American television history. He was simply a character in a short student film, living in the particular impermanence that student work inhabits before the world decides what to do with it. But Larry was fully himself from the very beginning. That is the thing that makes studying him so compelling. That is the quality that makes the comparison between Larry and Peter Griffin so illuminating when you look at them side by side. Larry did not need to be refined into a recognizable comedic creation. He arrived that way. The specific combination of elements that McFarlane assembled in that student film, the working-class warmth, the intellectual limitations worn without apology, the fundamental decency hidden underneath the bluster, the domestic situation anchored by a patient and somewhat exasperated wife, all of it was present and functional in the life of Larry, in a way that suggested McFarlane had been developing this character in his imagination for years, before he ever committed it to film. Which, given what we know about McFarlane's biography, he probably had. He grew up watching The Honeymooners and All in the Family. He absorbed the specific comedy of men like Ralph Kramden and Archie Bunker, not the bigotry of Bunker, which was always the target of the show's critique rather than its endorsement, but the archetype itself. The well-meaning but self-defeating patriarch? The man who believed more fully in his own competence than the available evidence warranted. The man who could not stop himself from making grand pronouncements and hatching ambitious plans that would inevitably unravel, and who somehow remained lovable through every unraveling. That archetype was old when Gleason played it, and it was old when O'Connor played it, and it was old when McFarlane built Larry from the same material. But McFarlane understood something important. Archetypes do not expire. They renew. Every generation needs its version of the man who means well and gets things wrong, because that story resonates in a way that does not diminish with repetition. Larry was in his 40s, balding in a way that suggested the hairline had retreated slowly over many years rather than all at once, the way real hairlines recede, in the gradual, unglamorous fashion that real men experience. He carried extra weight in the middle in a way that was not played for cruelty. It was simply there, part of his physical reality, the natural consequence of a life lived at a particular pace and with a particular diet and a particular relationship to exercise that most middle-aged American men would recognize in themselves if they were being honest. He was animated in McFarlane's own hand with the slightly rough quality of serious student work, not crude, but not polished in the way that professionally produced television animation is polished. There was something almost appealing about the roughness. The way hand-drawn student animation sometimes has a warmth that overproduced work doesn't. He had a wife named Lois. She was present in the thesis film in a supporting capacity that nevertheless felt immediately recognizable. She was patient, sharp, somewhat resigned to the specific texture of domestic life with Larry while also clearly committed to it. She was not a cartoon harridan, not a nagging wife in the broad and unpleasant sense that lesser comedies might have reached for. She was someone navigating a real partnership with real complications, which is a much harder thing to establish in 11 minutes of student film than most people would appreciate. And there was Steve. Steve the dog is the character who represents perhaps the most interesting evolutionary leap between the Larry Shorts and Family Guy, because Steve and Brian Griffin are separated by more than a name change and a color palette adjustment. Brian Griffin is among the most developed characters in the series, a dog who writes novels, drinks martinis, nurses existential crises about unrealized ambitions, has politics and opinions and failed relationships, and the particular despair of a person who is more aware of the gap between their aspirations and their actual life than they can comfortably live with. Brian is genuinely funny, genuinely sad, and genuinely complex in ways that animated television characters rarely achieve. Steve, in the life of Larry, is the beginning of that arc. He is clearly the most intelligent being in Larry's household. He speaks, he observes, he has opinions. But he is not yet the fully formed literary figure that Brian would become over 25 years of character development. He is the seed of that character, the essential concept, the irreducible core of the idea. A dog who thinks more clearly than his owner, who navigates the world with a particular weary sophistication that makes the fact of his species simultaneously absurd and somehow completely logical. If you know Brian Griffin and you watch Steve in the life of Larry, you do not feel like you are watching a different character. You feel like you are watching someone slightly younger, slightly less formed, slightly less scarred by experience. Someone who has not yet accumulated all the disappointments that will eventually make him into the animal sitting at the bar in the Griffin house, drinking scotch and reading Raymond Carver. The film found an audience, not a large one, but the right one. McFarlane's professor at RISD, a man named John Rosenfeld, watched The Life of Larry and felt strongly enough about it to do something concrete with that feeling. He submitted it to Hanna-Barbera Productions. He did not do this because he was certain of the outcome or because he had some guarantee that the studio would respond. He did it because the film deserved to be seen by people who could do something with it, and that is what mentors do when they recognize something worth fighting for. Hanna-Barbera watched it and offered McFarlane a job. The professional development period that followed, during which McFarlane worked on Cartoon Network shows while continuing to develop his own ideas on the side, is worth understanding in some detail because it shaped the sensibility that would eventually define Family Guy in significant ways. Johnny Bravo, the show he wrote for, was built on a very specific comedic premise. The joke was always at the expense of the main character's blind spots, his vanity and his overconfidence functioning as constant generators of situations that he could not navigate but absolutely believed he could. The humor was observational and somewhat anthropological, examining the specific delusion of a particular kind of American masculinity through the distorting lens of cartoon exaggeration. That mode of comedy, where the human subject of the joke is always the protagonist rather than some external target, would become fundamental to Family Guy's approach to Peter Griffin. Dexter's Laboratory, which McFarlane also contributed writing to, operated on a completely different comedic principle. The humor there came from juxtaposing Dexter's extraordinary scientific intelligence with the completely ordinary circumstances of childhood and family life. The joke was always about the collision between the exceptional and the mundane, about the way that genius and domestic reality occupy the same space without ever fully making peace with each other. That sensibility, that particular kind of comedy that comes from placing extraordinary minds inside ordinary circumstances, is visible in Brian Griffin and in the early incarnation of Stewie, who began the series as a genuinely terrifying infant, with functioning energy weapons and a complete world domination agenda being pursued from a nursery decorated with teddy bears and building blocks. The Larry and Steve short that aired on Cartoon Network in 1997 was the critical bridge between the student thesis film and the Fox pitch. It was refined, more confidently animated than the thesis film, sharper in its comedic timing. The premise Larry adopts Steve, the talking dog, after finding him in a pound was lean and unpretentious. It did not try to be something it wasn't. It was exactly the thing it was, which is a mark of real creative confidence. Fox saw the short, and Fox saw the thesis film, and someone at Fox had the perceptiveness to recognize that what they were looking at was not just a series of amusing short films about a middle-aged man and his cognitively gifted dog. What they were looking at was a complete comedic universe with a functioning internal logic and a distinctive voice, and a creator who clearly knew exactly what he was building and why. They wanted a pitch pilot. The process of translating Larry into Peter is worth examining carefully, because the choices McFarlane made and the choices that were made collaboratively between McFarlane and Fox during the development process are where the original and the broadcast versions of the show begin to diverge. Peter Griffin is not simply Larry with a different name. There are meaningful differences, and those differences illuminate what got added and what got subtracted as the concept moved from student project to professional television production. The name change itself is instructive. Larry is a specific, somewhat old-fashioned name with particular cultural connotations. It suggests a specific generation, a specific social stratum, a certain pre-ironic sincerity. The name Peter is slightly more neutral, slightly more timeless, slightly less geographically and demographically specific. Griffin, the mythological creature, half eagle and half lion, powerful and improbable and slightly absurd, adds a layer of comedic undertone that Larry's last name, which was never definitively established across the shorts, did not have. The naming process for the Griffin family tells you something about the tonal adjustment the show was making as it moved from student project to network production. Becoming slightly more self-aware, slightly more deliberate in its construction, slightly more designed, Larry's physical design evolved into Peter's more familiar look. The details shifted: hair color, proportions, the specific geometry of the face. These are the kinds of adjustments that happen naturally during professional character development. When a design that works in a student context gets refined for the requirements of broadcast production, for the constraints of animation pipelines, for the need to produce 22 episodes per season rather than one 11-minute short. But the essential comedic silhouette remained the same: the roundness, the receding hairline, the specific physical vocabulary of a man who is both more and less than he appears. What the Larry Shorts had that Family Guy in its broadcast form would not always have, at least in the early seasons, was a kind of unguarded rawness. A quality of exposure, almost. When you watch The Life of Larry, there is a feeling that you are watching someone show you something they actually care about, without the protective layer of institutional production between the creator and the audience. The film is rough around the edges, and that roughness is part of what makes it feel immediate and personal. As the concept was developed into the pitch pilot, and eventually into a television series, the production quality improved dramatically. The animation became more sophisticated, the comedic timing was honed, but some of that rawness was lost in the process. That is always the bargain. Professionalization is simultaneously an elevation and a slight domestication. You gain resources and technical quality and reach, and you surrender something of the particular flavor that comes from making things when the only constraint is your own imagination. MacFarlane understood this bargain and made it consciously. He was not naive about what commercial television production required. He had been working in professional animation long enough to understand the institutional pressures that shaped broadcast work. What he was trying to do, with every tool available to him, was hold on to as much of the original vision as he could while giving the network enough of what they needed to put the show on the air. That negotiation between the creator's original instinct and the network's practical requirements would continue for the entire history of the show. It is still continuing. It began with the moment Fox handed him $50,000 and asked him to build the world he had been carrying in his head since Connecticut. In those months in his apartment, drawing alone, MacFarlane was in the closest proximity he would ever be to the original version of his vision. Nobody was asking him to make changes yet. Nobody was expressing concerns about audience research or demographic targeting or episode structures. It was just him and the drawing table and the characters he had been living with since graduate school, becoming real on paper in the quiet of a Los Angeles night. Larry was there in those rooms too, in some form. Not as a character who would appear on screen, but as the seed from which everything else was growing. The DNA of an empire, as invisible and essential as actual DNA, present in everything but visible in almost nothing, carrying forward the blueprint of a comedic vision that would eventually reach more people than Seth MacFarlane could have imagined sitting alone at his kitchen table, drawing through the night. Section 3. The original 1998 pilot. What Fox actually saw? The 16-minute film that Seth MacFarlane produced in his apartment in 1997 and 1998 on a budget of $50,000 was, for a long time, one of the more intriguing pieces of lost media in American animation history. Not lost in the sense of being completely inaccessible. Fox had it, presumably. MacFarlane had it, presumably. The people who had been directly involved in its production had access to some version of it, but lost in the more ordinary and more frustrating sense of being not quite findable by the people who most wanted to find it, the animators and archivists and enthusiasts and fans who had been aware of the pilot's existence for years and had been looking for it, in the way that dedicated media archaeologists look for things, systematically and patiently, across every available archive and database and online repository. A 7-minute version of the pilot had been included on a DVD release in 2003, the Family Guy DVD set, that became part of the extraordinary revival story that we will get to in a later section of this script. 7 minutes of a 16-minute film? Enough to confirm that the pilot was meaningfully different from the series that eventually aired. Enough to raise questions about what the other 9 minutes contained. Not enough to satisfy anyone who was genuinely curious about the full extent of the divergences. The full pilot was finally located, and this is genuinely remarkable given how recently it happened in March of 2025. An organization called the Lost Media Wiki, which exists precisely to document and recover media that has fallen out of general accessibility, discovered that the complete 16-minute pilot had been sitting on the personal website of an animator named Robert Paulson, who had been involved in the original production, essentially undiscovered for years. It was not hidden. It was simply on a personal website, not widely linked. not showing up in the searches that people had been running for years. Available and unfound at the same time, in the specific way that a great deal of important material exists in the digital age, technically accessible, practically invisible. When people finally watched the full 16-minute pilot, what they saw confirmed and exceeded what the 7-minute excerpt had suggested. This was a meaningfully different version of Family Guy. Not unrecognizable, the basic structure, the humor rhythms, the fundamental character dynamics were all present in forms that showed their family resemblance to the broadcast series immediately, but different in ways that were significant and revealing, that illuminated what the development process had changed and what it had preserved. The most visually striking difference involves Lois Griffin. In the aired version of Family Guy, Lois is a redhead. Her warm auburn hair is one of her most immediately recognizable visual characteristics, the quality that makes her identifiable on merchandise and promotional materials, and in the tens of thousands of pieces of fan art that have been produced over 25 years. In the original 1998 pilot, Lois is blonde. Not warm honey blonde, but a somewhat cooler, more silvery shade of blonde that gives the character a slightly different feeling, a slightly more classic American housewife visual coding that reads differently from the red-headed Lois that audiences eventually came to know. Her clothing is also different. Pilot Lois wears a red shirt, where broadcast Lois wears the characteristic green shirt that she has worn for the majority of the show's run. These are small changes on the surface, hair color, shirt color, but they are the kind of changes that accumulate to produce a meaningfully different visual impression. Red-headed Lois in her green shirt has a particular warmth, a visual energy that reads as slightly unconventional, slightly more individual. Blonde Lois in her red shirt reads as slightly more generic, slightly more in the tradition of the beautiful television wife, who exists primarily as an anchor and counterweight to the protagonist's chaos. The change to red hair was right. It made Lois her own character rather than a type. Glenn Quagmire, the character who would become one of the show's most recognizable and eventually most complicated presences, appears in the pilot in a form that is notably different from his broadcast incarnation. The distinctive Quagmire look, the oversized jaw, the specific hair configuration, the particular combination of physical features that immediately marks him as himself, is not yet fully developed in the pilot. He is recognizably adjacent to the Quagmire audiences know, but the design is not finished, not quite locked in the way that animated character designs need to be locked in before they can be produced at scale across a full series run. The finished Quagmire, the one that would appear from the first broadcast episode onward, has a more coherent visual identity, a design that functions as effectively at a distance as it does up close, that communicates character information at a glance in the way that the best animated character designs do. Tom Tucker, the Channel 5 news anchor who would become a recurring presence in the broadcast series, appears in the pilot under a different name. He is called Mike Tucker rather than Tom Tucker. This is the kind of detail that matters primarily because of what it reveals about the degree of ongoing development that was happening right up until the show went into production. Mike Tucker and Tom Tucker are essentially the same character, the sleek, self-satisfied local news anchor, vain and incurious, and entirely comfortable in his own superficiality. The name change is cosmetic, but it suggests that even the secondary characters were in a process of refinement during the pilot period, being adjusted and calibrated and renamed as the show's universe was assembled. MacFarlane's voice performance in the pilot is worth discussing because it contains one detail that would be completely erased by the time the broadcast series premiered. In the pilot, Seth MacFarlane voices Chris Griffin himself, in addition to voicing Peter and Stewie and Quagmire and several other characters. Seth Green, who would go on to voice Chris for the entire run of the broadcast series, bringing a particular deadpan teenager energy to the role that became one of the show's reliable pleasures, was not yet part of the cast. MacFarlane was handling Chris's voice as one of the many vocal duties he was juggling in the pilot, and the result is a Chris who sounds somewhat different from the character that audiences would eventually know. Seth Green's Chris has a specific quality, slightly dazed, slightly sincere, operating at a slight remove from the events around him that MacFarlane's pilot version does not fully replicate. Green was cast before the broadcast series went into production, and the character was better for it. Rachel MacFarlane, Seth's real sister, voices Meg in the pilot. Meg's voice would eventually be recast as well. Lacey Chabert voiced Meg for the first season, and Mila Kunis took over from the second season onward, creating the distinctive Meg voice that would endure for the rest of the series. In the pilot, Rachel McFarlane's Meg has a different quality from either Chabert or Kunis. She is a little harder, a little less defeated, in some ways more assertive than the Meg that audiences eventually knew. Meg's evolution across the broadcast series into the family's primary punching bag, the character upon whom the show's most ruthless humor was exercised, was a development that happened gradually as the writers discovered how the character functioned within the ensemble. The pilot Meg, voiced by the creator's own sister, is a slightly different creature, the voice of Mr. Weed, Peter's boss at the toy factory, a character who would be killed off relatively early in the broadcast series in a memorable episode involving a disastrously uncontrolled dinner party, is handled in the pilot by Butch Hartman, who would go on to create The Fairly OddParents and Danny Phantom and establish himself as one of the most prolific creators in children's animation. Hartman's Mr. Weed is somewhat softer, somewhat more conventionally boss-like, than the version that would appear in the broadcast series. His presence in the pilot represents one of many casual connections between the early Family Guy production and the broader animation community of the late 1990s. The structural differences in the pilot story are perhaps more illuminating than the casting changes. The pilot tells a story that is recognizably the template for the broadcast series premiere Peter at the Factory. Something going wrong, family dynamics being established, but it handles certain plot points differently. One of the most telling differences involves how Lois learns about Peter's work situation. In the broadcast version of the premiere, there is a delay, a comedic deception sequence in which Peter tries to conceal his employment difficulties from his family before the truth inevitably comes out. In the pilot, it is Chris who tells Lois about the situation almost immediately, short-circuiting the potential deception narrative and moving the story forward in a more direct fashion. The broadcast version is funnier. Structurally, the gap between Peter's concealment strategy and the inevitable revelation generates the kind of escalating comedic discomfort that the show would become expert at generating. But the pilot's more direct version is interesting, precisely because it suggests a slightly different tonal calibration for the show's relationships, a slight departure from the domestic comedy of deception tradition in favor of something a bit more transparent. There is also the question of what was not yet present in the pilot. The cutaway format, the specific comedic technique that Family Guy would develop into its most distinctive structural trademark, is only rudimentarily present in the 1998 pilot. The show that eventually aired used cutaways as a constant grammatical feature. The narrative would be interrupted by a character saying something like, "This is worse than the time I," and then the scene would cut to a completely unrelated vignette, a non sequitur that generated humor from its irrelevance before the story resumed. That technique is one of the most immediately recognizable things about Family Guy, the thing that most clearly distinguishes its comedic approach from The Simpsons and from most other animated comedies. In the pilot, it is present but not fully developed as a systematic technique. It is a tool that McFarlane was using intuitively without yet having fully developed it into the architectural principle of comedic construction that it would become. What the pilot makes unmistakably clear is how quickly and confidently McFarlane had translated the Larry material into something television-ready. The family dynamics work. The character relationships have internal logic. The humor operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There is always something for the person paying close attention to catch that the person paying less attention might miss. The distinctive rhythm of the show's comedy, that particular tempo that fans recognize and that parody inevitably reaches for first when it tries to evoke Family Guy, is already present and already functional. Fox executives watched the 16-minute pilot and ordered the series immediately. Not a development deal, not a further pilot phase, not a second pilot with changes, a full series order. McFarlane was signed to a contract that reportedly offered him approximately $2 million per season as executive producer. He was 24 years old. He became the youngest person ever to serve as executive producer on a network television series at that point in American television history, a record that stood for years and may still stand today. 24 years old. With a series order from one of the major broadcast networks and a record as the youngest executive producer in the history of the medium. And somewhere in a drawer or a hard drive or a storage unit, a 16-minute animated film that was slightly different from the show people were about to see, containing a blonde Lois and a Chris, voiced by the creator himself, and a secondary cast that was still in the process of being finalized. The pilot exists now, finally found, finally watchable. You can see it. You can trace the distances between what it was and what the show became. And when you do that tracing, when you follow the lines of development from the rough thesis film to the slightly more polished pilot to the broadcast series that 22 million people watched on Super Bowl Sunday, 1999, what you are watching is not just a piece of animation history. You are watching the process by which an original vision encounters the world, gets negotiated with and adjusted and revised and refined, and emerges the other side as something slightly different from what it was, and yet still, somehow, unmistakably itself. Section 4. Characters who were never born. Animation is a medium that leaves traces. In live-action film and television, the evidence of what didn't make it, the deleted scenes, the characters who were written out before production, the actors who auditioned and were not cast, tends to disappear relatively completely. What survives is what was shot, and what was not shot does not leave much behind. Animation is different. Animation requires such extensive pre-production work, such a long pipeline of drawing and design and voice testing and storyboarding, that the evidence of characters who were conceived and not completed tends to accumulate in physical and documentary form. There are design sheets in filing cabinets. There are storyboards that were started and put aside. There are voice recordings that were made during casting sessions and never edited into finished product. There are, in other words, traces. The characters who almost appeared in Family Guy, who were designed or discussed or partially developed before being set aside, represent one of the most fascinating categories of the show's alternative history. Because in many cases, the characters who didn't make it would have changed the show in ways that are difficult to fully calculate. And examining who they were and why they didn't survive illuminates something important about the creative decision-making process that produced the show we eventually got. Let us begin with the Griffin family itself, because the family as broadcast was not the family as originally conceived in the Larry Shorts, and the space between those two versions contains several characters who existed in one form and then ceased to exist in quite that form. In the life of Larry, the family unit that surrounded Larry consisted of his wife Lois and his son Milt. Just Milt. One child. A teenager in the shorts, a boy who shared some of Chris Griffin's general qualities, slightly aimless, slightly overwhelmed by the pace of the world around him, but who existed as the only child rather than as one of 3 siblings. When the family was being developed into the Griffin family for the pitch, and eventually for broadcast, the decision was made to expand it, 3 children instead of 1. The addition of Meg and Stewie, the creation of a fuller domestic ecosystem, the transformation of a somewhat stripped-down household into the complete and complicated family unit that the show would eventually make iconic. This expansion decision is one of the most consequential choices in the show's early development, and it is worth thinking about carefully, because each of the 3 children who eventually appeared in the broadcast series contributes something that would have been entirely absent in the original single-child configuration. Meg, the eldest, functions primarily as the character who experiences the gap between expectation and reality most acutely. She wants to be popular and isn't. She wants to be valued and is consistently overlooked. She is the family member who tries hardest to fit in with the outside world and fails most visibly, and that failure, which the show treats with varying degrees of cruelty across its long run, generates a specific kind of comedy that is actually more uncomfortable and more truthful than most of the show's humor. Meg's suffering is recognizable. Most people who have ever been a teenager in an American high school can access something in Meg's experience, even at its most exaggerated. Without Meg, there would have been an absence where that particular flavor of recognition lives. Chris, the middle child, fills a different comedic space. He is good-natured and slightly dim, operating most of the time from a position of cheerful incomprehension of the world's complexity. Seth Green's performance gives him a specific texture. There is always just a tiny undercurrent of unexpected depth in Chris. Moments where he says something that shouldn't be insightful but somehow is. Moments where his simplicity produces a kind of accidental wisdom that is funnier than it would be if it were deliberate. Chris without his siblings would have been a different kind of show. Milt in the original Larry Shorts was serviceable, but did not achieve the same density of comedic possibility that the three-sibling configuration allowed. And then there is Stewie, which brings us to the most significant character-related decision in the entire history of Family Guy's development, one of the most consequential single-character choices in the history of animated television, arguably. Stewie Griffin was not derived from any character in the Larry material. He was a new creation, something that McFarlane developed specifically for the series, and the character he was when the show premiered is so dramatically different from the character that audiences know and love today that they are almost more usefully understood as two separate beings who share a body and a name. The original Stewie, the Stewie of the first 3 seasons, approximately, before the character's gradual evolution began to smooth his sharper edges, was genuinely frightening. Not cartoon villain frightening in the comfortable sense where you know the threat is never real. Actually threatening in a way that operated in a peculiar comedic register that had no obvious precedent in animated television. He had fully functional weapons. His laboratory under the stairs in the Griffin house contained a laser cannon, a weather control device, a mind control device, and a range of other instruments of destruction that were depicted with a degree of specificity that suggested they were meant to function. His plans to kill Lois and achieve world domination were treated by the show with a serious internal logic. These were not aspirations expressed in frustration, the way that a cartoon villain might shake a tiny fist at the sky. Stewie's plans had budgets and timelines and contingency provisions. McFarlane has said in interviews that the character's original inspiration was Rex Harrison's Henry Higgins from My Fair Lady. The voice, the crisp, aristocratic, BBC-adjacent British accent deployed by an American infant was drawn directly from Harrison's performance. The condescension, the impatience with the inferior beings that surrounded him, the sense of someone operating at a level of refinement and intelligence that his physical circumstances could not begin to accommodate all of that was Harrison, filtered through the absurdist premise of an infant who had somehow arrived in the world already fully formed as an Edwardian English gentleman with an advanced education and a complete strategic mind. The question of whether Stewie was funny as a genuinely menacing infant genius or funnier as an increasingly campy pop culture referencing, eventually openly ambiguous character is one of the more interesting critical debates in Family Guy's history. The case for the original Stewie is that the comedy of a genuinely dangerous character embedded in a domestic situation has a specific edge that is impossible to replicate once the character is softened. When early Stewie fires his laser at Lois, the humor is generated partly by the absurdity of the situation, but also partly by the fact that you believe, within the show's internal logic, that the laser is real and that the threat is genuine. That belief is what makes the comedy work in a specific way that the later Stewie's more theatrical villainy cannot reproduce. But there is an equally strong case for the evolution. The show that the original Stewie belonged to was a different show in certain ways. More comfortable with darkness, more willing to let a scene sit with genuine menace for a moment before the next joke arrived. As Family Guy found its rhythm across its first few seasons and developed the full range of its comedic toolbox, Stewie's specific function shifted. He became less of a genuine threat and more of a source of theatrical comedic energy, his British affectations and pop cultural sophistication generating humor through incongruity rather than through genuine menace. Whether that shift was the right creative choice or a loss is something that different viewers feel differently about. What is not in dispute is that it was a change, and that the character who appears in the later seasons of Family Guy is not the character that was originally designed. Beyond the Griffin family, there were other characters who were considered and not included, roles that were imagined and not filled. The development period for any long-running television series generates a great deal of creative material that never reaches the screen, and Family Guy was no exception. Various neighbor characters, various secondary figures in Peter's professional and social orbit were conceived and refined, and either incorporated into the show or set aside during the development process. Cleveland Brown and Joe Swanson, the two neighbors who would become primary members of the main ensemble alongside Quagmire, were developed with specific care during pre-production. Cleveland warm, measured, patient, the counterbalance to Peter's impulsiveness in their friend group was designed to fill a particular space in the ensemble dynamic. Joe, a police officer confined to a wheelchair following an incident that the show would reference and re-reference across its run, with a specific fierce physical energy that his wheelchair does not diminish, brought something that none of the other characters could provide, a kind of combative determination, a refusal to be limited by limitation. Both characters worked well enough in the original formulation to eventually earn their own spin-off, at least in Cleveland's case, and both contributed something that the ensemble would have been notably poorer without. But there were others. Characters whose names never made it into the press coverage, whose designs never became merchandise, who existed only as possibilities in the development period before the show's universe closed around its final configuration. An entirely different set of Peter's colleagues at the toy factory. A different version of the local bar that would eventually become the Drunken Clam. Neighborhood families whose relationships to the Griffins were imagined and then abandoned. Each of these unmade characters represents a small branching point in the show's history, a moment where the story could have gone one way and went another. What is perhaps most interesting about the characters who didn't make it is the question of what they would have changed about the characters who did. Every ensemble has a particular chemistry that emerges from the specific combination of the people in it. The four-friend group of Peter, Cleveland, Quagmire, and Joe has a particular dynamic, a set of complementary and competing energies that generate situations in ways that a different configuration would not. If any one of those characters had been replaced by one of the alternatives that were considered during development, the show that resulted would have been different in ways that are very difficult to predict. The chemistry of an ensemble is not reducible to the individual elements. It is something that emerges from their combination. The characters who were never born, never fully born, never made it to broadcast are the invisible architecture of the show that we eventually got. Their absence shaped the space that the present characters occupy. Their non-existence is, in a strange way, as formative as the existence of the people who stayed. Section 5. The version of Stewie that was too dark to stay. There is a moment in one of Family Guy's early episodes, it falls somewhere in the first or second season, depending on which version of the broadcast schedule you consult, in which Stewie Griffin casually activates a device he has built for the specific purpose of making his mother's life painful and, eventually, ending it. He does this with the particular quality of focused competence that early Stewie brought to all his projects. There is no rage, no frustration, no cartoon villainy in the operatic sense. Just a one-year-old going about a task that he has spent time and resources preparing for, applying the same methodical energy to the attempted elimination of his mother that another child of his age might apply to stacking wooden blocks. What makes this scene remarkable, what made early Stewie remarkable as a comedic creation, particularly when you set him beside the character he would eventually become, is that it was meant to be taken seriously within the logic of the show's world, not realistic seriously. The show was a cartoon. Stewie was an infant who spoke in complete paragraphs. The kind of serious involved was something more specific, the conviction that this was the genuine situation, that these were the actual stakes, that the menace was not theatrical but functional. The humor came from that conviction. If Stewie's threats were clearly jokes, if the laser cannon was obviously fake, if the weather control machine was never going to work, then the comedy collapsed. The comedy required belief. It required you to accept, for the duration of each scene, that this infant was the most dangerous person in any room he entered. McFarlane developed this character from a source that is clear in retrospect, but was not obvious to audiences at the time: Rex Harrison's Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady. Not the plot of the film, Stewie's relationship with his mother is almost the precise inverse of Higgins' relationship with Eliza Doolittle, where Higgins was transforming a working-class girl into something refined, and Stewie was trying to eliminate the woman who represented the limitations of his current physical circumstances. But the voice, the posture, the entire emotional register was Harrison, the clipped, aristocratic British delivery, the magnificent impatience with lesser minds, the confidence of a man who has never seriously entertained the possibility that he might be wrong about anything. The sense, in every scene, of someone who has been incommodiously deposited in a world that is too small for him and is managing that inconvenience with barely concealed contempt. This was, as a comedic concept, genuinely inspired. The joke operated on so many levels simultaneously that it is almost too layered to fully unpack in real time when you are watching it. There is the physical absurdity of an infant doing these things. There is the linguistic absurdity of the Victorian gentleman's diction and the infant's situation occupying the same character. There is the comedic potential of the family simply not noticing or not fully processing what Stewie is doing. Adults in the show treated Stewie's plots and devices with a casual obliviousness that was itself funny. There is the specific comedy of competence, the humor that comes from watching someone who is genuinely very good at something apply that competence to an entirely wrong target. Stewie's engineering capabilities are real within the show's logic. His energy weapons function, his time machine works. The fact that all of this extraordinary ability is being directed toward the goal of killing one's own mother and achieving world domination is the joke, and it is funnier because the ability is real. What happened to this Stewie? Where did he go? The answer is gradual, and gradual is important to understand when you are thinking about character evolution in a long-running television series. Nothing happened all at once. Nobody sat down in a writer's room and said, "Let's make Stewie less menacing and more campy." There was no single decision point, no memo, no network note that targeted the specific quality that made early Stewie the character that he was. What happened instead was a slow drift, beginning somewhere around the third or fourth season, in which the show began to use Stewie differently. His plans became less central to episode plots. His weapons appeared less frequently. The genuine menace began to recede, replaced gradually by something else, a more theatrical, more self-aware, more pop-culture-engaged version of the character. The campy Stewie, the version that would dominate from roughly the fifth season onward, is not without comedic value. He is funny. He generates humor reliably, but he generates a different kind of humor from a different place than the original character. The early Stewie was funny because he was genuinely threatening, and yet the show treated him as a minor inconvenience. The later Stewie is funny because he is theatrical in an enjoyable way, because his cultural references land, because he has developed relationships within the ensemble that generate their own comedic dynamics. The friendship with Brian, which became one of the show's most beloved running elements and eventually spawned The Road to. Series of crossover episodes emerged from the later Stewie, the softened Stewie, the Stewie who had evolved away from his original function. Those episodes, where Stewie and Brian go on adventures together and the comedy emerges from their specific dynamic of mutual affection and mutual exasperation, are among the best work the show has ever done. They would not have been possible with the original Stewie. The original Stewie did not have friendships. He had targets, he had tools, and he had contempt. The warmth that the Brian and Stewie episodes require was not available in the original character's emotional palette. So, the evolution was not purely a loss. It was a trade. Something genuine and specific and irreplaceable was surrendered, and something different and valuable was gained in return. Whether the trade was worth making is a question that different people who love the show will answer differently. MacFarlane himself has been reflective about it in interviews, noting that the original Stewie was a product of a particular moment in the show's life, and that keeping him exactly as he was might not have served the show's long-term interests. He has also acknowledged, in the careful way that a creator acknowledges these things, that something was lost. There is also a different version of the Stewie evolution story that is worth considering, one that involves the specific cultural and network context of the show's early life. Family Guy premiered in 1999. The broadcast television landscape of 1999 had specific tolerance thresholds for darkness in animated comedy that were meaningfully different from what they might be today. The Simpsons had been on the air for a decade and had established that animated primetime comedy could be intelligent and sometimes uncomfortable. South Park had premiered on Comedy Central in 1997 and had demonstrated that animation could go places that nobody had previously considered taking it in terms of content. But a character on a major network who was genuinely attempting to murder a family member week after week with functioning technology represented something that had not been tested before. Fox received mail about Stewie. Specific mail. Organized concern. Parents who found the infanticide jokes too vivid, too specific, too committed. Standards and practices, conversations that circled around the question of how dark a comedy character could be on network primetime television. The pressure was not dramatic enough to result in an immediate mandate for change. The show's ratings were too important for anyone to push very hard, but it was present, and it was cumulative, and it likely contributed to the gradual de-escalation of Stewie's menace over the first few seasons of the show's life. The version of Stewie that was imagined before the broadcast version was compromised before the network concerns and the ratings, anxieties, and the institutional pressures of producing 22 episodes a season had all done. Their work was considerably darker. MacFarlane has discussed in various interviews over the years what he originally envisioned for the character's arc. In the original conception, Stewie's world domination plans were meant to be taken more seriously by the show's narrative. There were story arcs planned in which his devices actually functioned catastrophically, in which the consequences of ignoring an evil infant genius who was living in your house became real and could not be easily dismissed. There were episode ideas explored during the development period in which Stewie's plans succeeded, at least temporarily, before being reversed. The character was meant to be more than a recurring dark joke. He was meant to be a genuine narrative force. None of that survived the transition from conception to broadcast in its original form. What remained was the vocal quality, the essential premise, the character's name and face, and the residue of his original function. Enough to be recognizable, enough to be funny, enough to generate the specific chemistry with the rest of the family that made him work, but not the full original version. Never the full original version. There is a spin-off coming, announced in March of 2026, with a 2-season order already in place, targeting a premiere in the 2027 to 2028 season. It is a Stewie-focused project, co-created by MacFarlane with writer Kirker Butler. What version of Stewie that show will contain, whether it will reach backward toward the original character's darkness or continue forward with the evolved version, is something that nobody outside the production currently knows. But the announcement is interesting precisely because it suggests that the character still contains enough unexplored material, enough unrealized potential to sustain an entire show built around him. That potential was always there. It was there in the original conception. Some of it was developed across 25 years of the main series. Some of it was set aside when the network pressures and the cultural moment and the specific requirements of a broadcast comedy demanded something slightly gentler, slightly more accessible, slightly less committed to the darkness that had made the original version so arresting. The Stewie we got was excellent. The Stewie we almost got was something else entirely. And in the space between those two versions of the same character lives one of the most interesting roads not taken in the history of American animated television. Section 6. Unmade episodes and shelved story ideas. Every television writer's room generates far more material than any series can use. This is simply the arithmetic of how long-running television works. A show is renewed, the writer's room is assembled or reassembled, since the composition of a room tends to shift somewhat from season to season as the show evolves, and new writers are brought in and older ones move on. The room begins breaking stories. Someone pitches an idea. The room discusses it, pushes it, finds the angles that work and the angles that don't, and by the end of a productive day of breaking, there is either the skeleton of an episode plot that can be assigned to a writer for scripting, or there is a cleaner version of the room's collective understanding of why that particular idea did not quite work. Either outcome is useful. The story that doesn't work tells you something about your characters and your world that the story that does work cannot always tell you. Family Guy's writer's room, across 25 seasons and more than 400 episodes, has generated an enormous amount of material that never made it to broadcast. Some of it was never scripted ideas that were discussed in the room and set aside at the concept stage. Some of it was scripted and then shelved before production. Some of it was produced and then pulled from broadcast at the last minute, for reasons that range from the practical to the political to the deeply complicated. The accumulated archive of Family Guy stories that were conceived and not completed represents a parallel history of the show, a shadow series that runs alongside the one that actually aired, episode for episode, season by season, containing the alternatives that the creative process generated and then passed over. 2 episodes stand above all others in the catalog of unmade and unaired Family Guy material, and they deserve extended examination because they each illuminate something important about the specific pressures that shaped the show's development. The first is an episode titled When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. It was written during the 3rd season of the show's original run, before the 2002 cancellation that we will get to in the next section. The plot involves Peter Griffin becoming convinced, through a series of typically convoluted comedic circumstances, that what his life is missing is a Jewish accountant, someone with the financial acuity that Peter himself conspicuously lacks, and his subsequent quest to find one. The episode culminates in a subplot involving a Las Vegas trip and a decision about Chris's religious education that generates the plot's central comedic conflict. The episode contains a song, a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star, the classic Disney number, rewritten as a meditation on Peter's idealized imagining of Jewish financial wisdom. The song is not mean-spirited in any simple sense. It operates in the specific register of comedy that finds humor in the stereotype by exposing the stereotype's absurdity, using Peter's credulity and simplicity as the actual target of the joke. But Fox's Standards and Practices Department was nervous about it. They were specifically and acutely nervous about the central song, which they felt crossed a line regardless of its satirical framing. Was this anti-Semitic? Was the show making a joke at the expense of Jewish people, even if the framing placed the ignorance and the prejudice with Peter rather than with the show itself? These were genuine questions, not dismissible ones, and Fox took several years to resolve them. The episode was shelved. Not permanently shelved is the right word, not canceled. It existed as a completed broadcast-ready episode that was not being broadcast. This state persisted for 4 years. The episode was finally aired in August of 2003 by Adult Swim, who had acquired the rerun rights and were less constrained by the particular anxieties that had led Fox to put it aside. Fox itself eventually broadcast the episode in April of 2004, after the Adult Swim airing had demonstrated that the comedic world had not ended. The episode, when audiences finally saw it, was recognized as one of the stronger episodes of the early seasons, focused, emotionally grounded by the standard of a Family Guy episode, and ultimately more affectionate toward its subject matter than the preliminary concerns had suggested it might be. The second episode is different in character and more completely unresolved. Partial Terms of Endearment. This episode was produced during the 8th season and deals with the subject of surrogacy specifically, with Lois agreeing to serve as a surrogate mother for a friend, and then navigating the physical, emotional, and ethical complications of that arrangement, including the discovery after the friend's death that carrying the pregnancy to term would be doing so for a stranger. The plot is built around the abortion question. It does not avoid it. It goes directly toward it. The episode takes the subject seriously while still functioning as a Family Guy episode, which means it also generates humor from the situation, but the humor does not replace the seriousness. Both things are present simultaneously. Fox never aired it in the United States. Not during the original broadcast run, not afterward, not at any point before the writing of this script. The BBC Three network in the United Kingdom broadcast the episode in June of 2010. It has been available on DVD since 2010 as well, meaning that American audiences who wanted to see it had legal means of access. But it never appeared on the American network that produced it. Fox made the specific determination that an episode about abortion, regardless of its approach or its quality, was not appropriate for broadcast in the American television context. The cultural and political temperature around reproductive rights in the United States made the episode too incendiary to air, even for a show that had regularly pushed into uncomfortable territory on a dozen other subjects. Partial Terms of Endearment is, by the accounts of the people who watched it when it aired in the UK and on DVD, a genuinely good episode. It is not a propaganda piece. It does not argue one side of the abortion debate against the other. It is a Family Guy episode that takes an honest look at a complicated human situation and finds both humor and genuine feeling in it, which is what the best episodes of the show have always done. Its non-airing in America represents one of the most specific and clearest instances of external pressure reshaping the show's output, not through the gradual institutional forces that changed Stewie over multiple seasons, but through a single sharp prohibition. Beyond these two famous cases, the shelved episode archives almost certainly contain material that has never been publicly documented. Writers' room discussions of story ideas that were not pursued because they were too dark, too politically exposed, too close to recent events, too likely to generate controversy that the show did not need at a particular moment in its history. MacFarlane has discussed in general terms the experience of having ideas that he wanted to pursue that were not possible within the constraints of network broadcasting stories that required a creative freedom that Fox was not able to provide. There are also story ideas that were abandoned not because of external pressure, but because they simply did not work. The room tried to break them, found that the comedic mechanics did not function correctly, discovered that the character behaviors required by the plot were incompatible with the established personalities of the family, and set them aside. These are the story failures that every writer's room accumulates, and that every showrunner makes peace with the evidence that not every idea is good, that the process of developing stories involves generating a lot of material that will not make it, and recognizing clearly and quickly enough which material that is. There are the episode ideas that came close. Scripts that were written and went through table reads and generated genuine enthusiasm in the room before being tabled for reasons of pacing or redundancy or scheduling. The room that has been running for 25 seasons and 400 episodes contains within it a second and third show's worth of material that was created and not completed. That material exists somewhere in hard drives, in script drafts, in the memories of the writers who worked on it. It is the shadow archive of a show that has been one of the most prolific in the history of American animation. What is perhaps most interesting about the shelved episodes and abandoned story ideas is what they reveal about the limits of the show's freedom. Family Guy has been marketed throughout its history as a show that goes places other shows won't go, that treats nothing as sacred, that pushes past the conventional limits of broadcast content. And that reputation is not entirely false. The show has done things that other primetime network comedies would not or could not do. But the catalog of things it couldn't do, the things that ended up in the archive rather than on the screen, demonstrates that the freedom was always relative. There was always a network. There were always standards and practices. There were always cultural and political contexts that shaped what was possible. The version of Family Guy that existed in MacFarlane's head, the fully unconstrained version, contained all the shelved episodes and all the abandoned story ideas and all the darkness that had been gently and gradually extracted over 25 years of broadcast production. That version was never made, but the evidence of it is scattered across the historical record, in interviews and press coverage, and the documented existence of episodes that were completed and not broadcast. It is a version of the show that exists only in fragments, never as a whole, never in the form that its creator might have imagined before the institutional forces of commercial television did what institutional forces always do. Section 7. The cancellation that changed everything. On the night of the 14th of February, 2002, Fox aired what it believed to be the final episode of Family Guy. It was a Valentine's Day, which is a detail that has a particular irony to it. The show was canceled on the day of Hearts and Love, set aside by the network that had ordered it, produced it, and then grown gradually disenchanted with its ratings trajectory. The episode that aired that night was not produced with any knowledge that it would be the last one. The writer's room had no advanced warning sufficient to give the finale the conscious resonance that a planned series conclusion might have carried. It was simply the last episode of a season that turned out to be the last season of a show, not yet knowing it was the last thing. The cancellation was not entirely surprising to people inside the production. The show had been in and out of difficulty with Fox since its initial run. It had been canceled once before, during 2000, between its second and third seasons, before being renewed or uncancelled. Depending on how you choose to narrate the sequence of events when Fox reconsidered, the ratings had been inconsistent. The network's faith in the show had been variable. There had been periods of genuine enthusiasm within Fox's programming leadership for what Family Guy was doing, and periods of much cooler assessment. By February 2002, the cooler assessment had prevailed, and the show's officially announced cancellation was, for most of the people directly involved, not a complete shock. But a confirmed, publicly announced cancellation is meaningfully different from a cancellation that is merely feared. When the official announcement came, something changed. The writers and the voice cast and the animators and all the people who had been building the show for 3 seasons went through the specific professional grief that a cancellation produces, the acknowledgement that the thing you have been working on is ending, that the universe you have been collectively building is closing, that the characters you have been giving voice to are going to stop speaking. Family Guy entered what everyone involved assumed would be permanent retirement. MacFarlane continued his career. He developed other projects. The voice cast dispersed to other work. The writers moved on to other rooms. The show settled into the particular category of television program that is over, not forgotten exactly, not without a legacy, but over in the practical sense of being no longer in production. And then something extraordinary happened. Something that almost never happens in American television, and that changed the future of the medium's relationship to its own history in ways that are still being processed. Fox had sold the rerun rights to Family Guy to Adult Swim, the late-night programming block that Cartoon Network had launched in September of 2001. Adult Swim had acquired Family Guy as part of its strategy of programming adult-oriented animation and live-action content for its late-night hours, a strategy that was proving popular and that was helping Cartoon Network and its parent company Turner Broadcasting establish a meaningful presence in the late-night television landscape. Family Guy reruns began airing on Adult Swim on the 20th of April, 2003, approximately 14 months after the Valentine's Day cancellation. The show that Fox had determined was performing insufficiently well to justify continued production found, in its Adult Swim rerun slot, an audience that had not been there in precisely the right demographic concentration during its original Fox run. Late-night cable animation attracted younger viewers who were precisely in the demographic that advertisers valued most aggressively in 2003. The reruns performed. Then they performed well. Then they performed extraordinarily well. 239%. That is the viewership increase that Family Guy's Adult Swim run generated compared to what Fox had originally been measuring. Not a modest improvement, not a recovery. An explosion of audience interest that turned a canceled show into one of the most watched programs on cable television in its time slot. The numbers were not ambiguous. The numbers were not a matter of interpretation. The numbers were a clear signal that the show that Fox had canceled for underperformance was, in fact, performing in a different distribution context, reaching a different audience configuration. It was performing at a level that the original broadcast run had never approached. The DVD market confirmed and amplified what the Adult Swim numbers were showing. This is an important part of the story that is sometimes underplayed in the standard narrative of Family Guy's revival. In the early 2000s, the market for television series on DVD was expanding rapidly. Shows were being released in full-season box sets for the first time. The first Family Guy DVD, a set containing the first 2 seasons, sold 400,000 copies in its initial run. This was not a modest performance. This was evidence of a financially significant audience that was willing to pay real money for physical ownership of a show that a network had decided wasn't worth continuing. Fox was watching these numbers. Fox was watching the Adult Swim numbers and the DVD sales numbers simultaneously and doing the calculation that any commercially rational broadcaster does when the numbers are that clear. The show they had canceled had an audience. The audience was substantial. The audience was young and demographically valuable. The audience was actively spending money in the DVD market and delivering ratings on Adult Swim that suggested real, sustained engagement. The cancellation decision looked, from the vantage point of 2003 and into 2004, increasingly questionable. In May of 2003, Fox formally announced the revival of Family Guy. New episodes would be produced. Seth MacFarlane and the principal creative team would return. The voice cast would be reassembled. The show that had been canceled on Valentine's Day 2002 was coming back. This had never quite happened before. Television shows had been renewed after cancellations before there were historical precedents, shows that had gotten second chances at the same network or moved to new ones. But the specific mechanism of the Family Guy revival DVD sales and cable rerun ratings demonstrating audience interest sufficiently to reverse a major broadcast network's cancellation decision was new. It established something about the television landscape that would reverberate through the industry for years, that the audience for a canceled show did not evaporate when the show was canceled, that it could be measured, aggregated, and used to make the economic case for revival, that the relationship between a show and its audience was more durable and more economically legible than previous models of broadcast economics had assumed. Season 4 of Family Guy premiered on Fox on the 1st of May 2005. The gap between the Valentine's Day 2002 cancellation and the May 2005 premiere was slightly over 3 years. 3 years in which the show had lived in the rerun market and the DVD market and in the memories of the people who had made it and the people who had watched it. 3 years in which the version of Family Guy that had existed as a canceled show became the version that would come back revived, changed by the experience of cancellation and revival in ways both visible and subtle. The show that returned in 2005 was not identical to the show that had been canceled in 2002. It could not have been. 3 years had passed. The world had changed. September 11th had happened between the cancellation and the revival, and the cultural context of American comedy had shifted in ways that both constrained and liberated different kinds of humor. MacFarlane and the returning writers had 3 years of distance from the characters and 3 years of observation of how the audience had responded to reruns and DVD releases. They knew things about the show's audience that they had not known during the original run. They came back with a different set of tools and a different understanding of what the show could and couldn't do. The revival also brought changes that were not entirely positive, depending on your perspective. The show that returned was, in certain ways, harder-edged than the show that had been canceled, more willing to go to extreme comedic places, more comfortable with the shock humor that the early seasons had deployed sparingly. Some viewers found this liberation. Others found it a departure from the more grounded, character-based humor that they felt had been the show's strength in its original run. The debate about whether the post-revival Family Guy is better or worse than the pre-cancellation version has been running since 2005 and shows no signs of resolution. But none of that complication was visible on the 1st of May 2005, when Season 4 premiered. What was visible was simpler and more extraordinary. A show had come back from the dead. It had been canceled, definitively and officially, and it had come back. The mechanism of that comeback, the specific combination of DVD economics and cable rerun ratings, and a digital media landscape that was beginning to make it possible to measure audience engagement in ways that broadcast ratings systems could not, was unprecedented. And it pointed toward a future in which the relationship between shows and their audiences, and between audiences and the economic decisions that shaped television, would be permanently different. The cancellation that was meant to end Family Guy became, instead, the event that defined its legacy. Without the cancellation, the revival does not happen. Without the revival, the show does not run for 25-plus seasons. Without the DVD sales and the Adult Swim numbers, the industry does not learn the lesson about dormant audience value that has since shaped how studios and networks think about their libraries. The Valentine's Day cancellation was not the end. It was the event that made everything else possible. Section 8. Seth's original vision. The character Bible he carried in his head. Every television show begins as a document, not always a physical one. Not always a formatted pitch deck, or a character Bible with tabbed sections and headlined pages. Sometimes the document is entirely internal, carried in the mind of a single person who has been developing it for years before anyone else ever sees a page of it. The mental version of the document is often the most complete, the most detailed, the most fully imagined of all the forms it will take throughout its life. Because in the mental document, there are no production constraints. There are no budget considerations. There are no network concerns, no standards and practices objections, no scheduling realities that require certain story structures over others. There is just the vision, whole and clean and entirely itself. Seth MacFarlane carried the mental version of Family Guy for years before the pitch pilot existed. He had been working out the characters in his imagination since his RISD years, possibly before. He knew these people the way that writers sometimes know their characters, with an intimacy that is not available to anyone else, an understanding of motive and history and interior life that exists in the creator's mind, whether or not it ever appears on the screen. Brian Griffin's specific relationship to his own failed ambitions, Peter's particular combination of warmth and blind self-confidence, Lois's patience and its limits. The emotional architecture of the Griffin family, what held it together and what strained it was, worked out in MacFarlane's imagination long before the pitch pilot was drawn or the broadcast series was ordered. The character Bible that MacFarlane produced as part of the formal development process, the document that Fox received along with the pitch pilot, the written articulation of who these people were and what the show was trying to do, reflected this long internal development. Character Bibles for animated series typically describe the main characters in terms of their basic personality traits and their narrative function. They establish the setting, the tone, the specific type of humor the show deploys. They are practical documents designed to give a network's development executives enough of a framework to evaluate whether the proposed series fits their programming needs. What the Family Guy character Bible contained, beyond the standard format, was a specific and quite detailed sense of these characters as real people. McFarlane's notes on Peter described not just a stupid but lovable dad, but a specifically constituted personality, the particular way that Peter's limited intelligence coexisted with a genuine and deep love for his family, the specific mechanism by which his grandiosity and his warmth operated simultaneously within the same person. The notes on Brian were unusually literary for a character Bible entry. They reflected McFarlane's own reading and intellectual life, his sense of what it means to be a person who aspires to literary distinction, while lacking, perhaps, the specific kind of genius that literary distinction requires. Brian's relationship to his own ambitions was mapped with a precision that suggested McFarlane had been thinking about that relationship for a long time. The Stewie entry was, by all accounts, the most unusual section of the character Bible. McFarlane had to make the case to network executives who had certain understandable concerns about the concept that an infant who was attempting to murder his own mother and achieve world domination was a viable comedic premise for a primetime network comedy. He made that case by grounding the comedy in specificity. Stewie was not an abstraction, not a floating premise. He was a character with a precise voice, a precise set of motivations, a precise relationship to the other characters in the show that generated specific comedic situations rather than vague conceptual potential. The originality was in the detail. McFarlane understood that a character who was merely dark would not work. Stewie had to be dark and funny in a way that required technical precision to sustain. The show's setting was also more specifically conceived in the original character Bible than the broadcast series perhaps reflects. Cog, Rhode Island, the fictional town in which the Griffins live, was imagined by McFarlane as a specific kind of American place. He had lived in Rhode Island during his RISD years and had absorbed the specific texture of a certain kind of New England working-class community, small enough that everyone knows everyone, large enough to contain the full range of American social types, particular enough in its local character to have its own identity. The Griffin family was meant to be embedded in a specific community in a way that the best American sitcoms always are. The community was not merely background but was part of the show's identity, part of what gave the Griffin family their specific social context. This specificity of place matters more than it might seem. The Simpsons' Springfield is famously unlocatable, deliberately placed in an ambiguous American geography that allows it to stand in for anywhere. Family Guy's Rhode Island setting was originally more committed to actual Rhode Island specificity. McFarlane wanted the accents, the local institutions, the particular social texture of southern New England working-class life to be woven through the fabric of the show in ways that would make the fictional world feel grounded. Some of this survived into the broadcast series. The accents are there. The regional humor appears periodically, but the Rhode Island specificity softened over the course of the show's long run into a more generic American suburban setting that could have been anywhere. McFarlane's original vision for the show's humor was also more specifically literary than the show that eventually emerged from the broadcast pipeline. He has discussed in interviews his affection for writers whose comedy operates by accumulation and surprise comedians, and writers who build structures carefully and then subvert them in ways that reward the audience's attention. Bob Hope's specific technique of the comic callback, the setup that seems incidental and returns as a punchline several minutes or several pages later. Bing Crosby's particular deadpan timing, the specific craft of the radio comedians and the early television comedians who had been McFarlane's earliest models. That craft orientation was present in the early seasons of the show in a way that the later seasons, with their heavier reliance on the random-seeming cutaway and the shock value escalation, did not always preserve. There is also a version of the show's original vision that involves Brian Griffin in a considerably more central narrative role than the broadcast series actually gave him. In McFarlane's original conception, the relationship between Peter and Brian was the engine of the show in a more dominant way than Peter's relationship with his human family. The odd couple dynamic of the limited man and his brilliant dog was meant to be the primary comedic relationship, the thing that the show's episodic structure was built around. In the broadcast series, that relationship is important but competes with many other dynamics for the show's attention. The original vision was somewhat more focused, more committed to the specific comedy of these two characters navigating the world together. The McFarlane who pitched Family Guy to Fox in 1997 and 1998 was 23 and 24 years old. He was pitching from a position of genuine creative confidence, not arrogance, which implies a mismatch between self-assessment and ability, but the specific confidence of someone who has been developing an idea for years and knows it thoroughly enough to defend every aspect of it in a room with skeptical network executives. He knew why every character was the way they were. He knew what made each relationship work. He knew the specific blend of dark and warm that the show required to function, the proportions in which those elements needed to be present to prevent the darkness from becoming unpleasant and the warmth from becoming saccharine. Holding that balance was something he was acutely aware of. The show had to be funny in a way that was occasionally uncomfortable, because that specific discomfort was part of what made it interesting. But it also had to care about its characters in a way that gave the discomfort meaning, that prevented the show from tipping into something purely mean or purely nihilistic. The early seasons hold that balance with real consistency. There is something that operates like genuine affection in the Griffin family's dysfunction, something that allows the audience to laugh at the characters and also root for them simultaneously. That coexistence was not accidental. It was engineered by McFarlane's specific understanding of what the show needed to be. The years between the pitch and the broadcast premiere, and then the years between the original run and the revival, introduced forces into the show's development that pushed against that original calibration. Network television always pushes. The institutional pressures of commercial broadcasting, the accumulated effects of many seasons of production, the inevitable drift that occurs when the person who built the original vision is no longer in the room for every decision, all of these things moved the broadcast version of Family Guy away from the character Bible's original specifications. Not entirely, not all at once, but persistently and in a direction that McFarlane, watching the later seasons from the partial remove of his other projects and his NBC Universal deal and his Orville and his Ted franchise, clearly has feelings about. He has been careful in interviews. He is not given to direct criticism of the show that carries his name and his voice. But the careful phrasing of his more recent public statements about Family Guy, the way he frames the show's continued existence in terms of financial utility and audience satisfaction rather than creative passion, the way he talks about escape velocity as the reason the show continues, rather than the more energized language of a creator who is excited about where his creation is going, tells you something about the distance between the original vision and what the show has become over 25 years. The character Bible he carried in his head still exists in there somewhere. The fully formed original version, the one that existed before the network got involved, and before the cancellations scattered the writing room, and before the revival changed the calculus, and before 25 years of institutional production smoothed off some of the specific edges that made the show what it was in its first 3 seasons. That version is not publicly accessible. It lives in McFarlane's memory, but its traces are everywhere in the early episodes, in the specific way the Griffin family loves each other beneath their chaos, in Brian's particular quality of failed literary aspiration, in the early Stewie's specific menace, in Peter's specific combination of idiocy and genuine warmth. The original vision is visible in those early seasons, in the gaps between what the show does and what commercial television typically allows. It is visible in the show's willingness, in those years, to be somewhat stranger and somewhat darker and somewhat more emotionally honest than the broadcast comedy genre typically requires. That original vision is the show that was never fully made. The one that existed completely only in one person's head before the process of making television began. Section 9. The crossovers and spin-offs that almost existed. There is a version of Family Guy that exists in every other show Seth MacFarlane ever made. Not overtly. Not in the way that a planned crossover universe, the kind of interconnected franchise architecture that Marvel made commercially dominant in film and that animation producers have been attempting to replicate ever since, is visible and intentional and foregrounded. The presence of the Family Guy universe in MacFarlane's other work is subtler than that. It is present in the shared comedic sensibility, the specific rhythms and reference points and character archetypes that show up across American Dad and the Orville and the Ted films and the various other projects that MacFarlane has produced over a career that is now spanning the better part of 3 decades. These shows are not Family Guy. but they carry its DNA the way that any subsequent work carries the DNA of the foundational work that preceded and shaped it. The question of what crossovers and spin-offs were imagined for the Family Guy universe, what parallel shows and connected narratives were conceived during the show's development and long run, and what became of them is one of the more fascinating corridors in the history of a franchise that is more extensively imagined than most people outside its production fully appreciate. The most significant and the most successfully realized spin-off in the Family Guy canon is The Cleveland Show, which ran on Fox from 2009 to 2013. Cleveland Brown had been a supporting character in Family Guy since the first season, part of the friend group at the Drunken Clam alongside Peter, Quagmire, and Joe, a calm and measured presence who served partly as a counterbalance to Peter's volatility and partly as a source of gentle running comedy built around his specific personality and his sometimes strained domestic situation. The decision to build a spin-off around Cleveland was driven partly by the sense that the character had more comedic potential than his supporting role in Family Guy could fully develop, and partly by MacFarlane's track record. At that point, American Dad was running successfully. He was one of Fox's most valuable animation producers, and the network was interested in expanding the universe he had created. The Cleveland Show moved Cleveland and his family to Stoolbend, Virginia, where Cleveland reconnected with a childhood sweetheart and established a new domestic situation that would serve as the show's comedic engine. The show ran for 4 seasons and 88 episodes before being canceled in 2013. It was not a failure. 4 seasons is a meaningful run by any measure, but it never achieved the cultural footprint of Family Guy or the critical appreciation that American Dad would eventually earn. The spin-off that seemed like an expansion of the universe turned out to be a relatively self-contained detour. Cleveland returned to Family Guy's ensemble after the Cleveland Show's cancellation, as though the spin-off had been a temporary secondment rather than a permanent departure. But the Cleveland Show was the crossover and spin-off idea that actually got made. What about the ones that didn't? There were, during the early seasons of Family Guy's run, discussions about what other corners of the Griffin family universe might support extended narrative exploration. Quagmire, who developed over the show's run from a somewhat one-dimensional joke character into one of the more unexpectedly complex figures in the ensemble, was the subject of spin-off discussions at various points. His specific combination of breezy amorality and surprising moments of genuine emotional depth, the Quagmire, who delivers the famous speech about Brian's hypocrisies in Season 8, is the same Quagmire who occasionally reveals a history and an interior life that the show's surface. Treatment of him only partially reflects suggested a character who might sustain a show of his own. Nothing materialized. The discussions, to whatever extent they occurred, did not produce a development deal. Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-bound police officer who was one of the show's most consistent sources of a particular kind of comedy, built on the juxtaposition of fierce competence and physical limitation, was another character whose specific profile seemed potentially suited to spin-off development. A show built around Joe's professional life, around a cop who refuses to let his disability define his professional limitations, had an obvious structural engine and a clear tone. The comedy of Joe's episodes in Family Guy at its best is not mean-spirited about his situation. It is built on Joe's own refusal to be diminished by it, and that refusal is genuinely funny and occasionally genuinely moving. A spin-off built on that premise would have been doing something different from Family Guy proper, occupying a slightly different tonal territory. It did not happen. The crossover that was most eagerly anticipated by fans for years, and that eventually happened in a form that nobody had quite expected, was a Family Guy and Simpsons crossover. The relationship between Family Guy and The Simpsons has always been charged. The Simpsons is the foundational American primetime animated comedy, the show that proved the format could work on a major broadcast network, the show that made Fox's animation domination lineup conceptually possible. Family Guy arrived a decade later, compared inevitably to The Simpsons, and the comparison was not always favorable in either direction. There were Simpsons fans who found Family Guy's humor cheap and random, in ways that The Simpsons' more structured character comedy was not, and there were Family Guy fans who found The Simpsons' later seasons creaky and outdated in ways that Family Guy's faster-paced approach avoided. The shows coexisted in the same Sunday night lineup for years, while occupying different aesthetic territories. The crossover episode aired in September 2014, at the beginning of Family Guy's 13th season. It was titled The Simpsons Guy, and it was preceded by years of audience speculation about whether it would ever happen. The premise had the Griffin family traveling to Springfield after Peter's car is stolen, and the episode spent its runtime working through the specific comedy of the two universes, colliding each show's sensibility, encountering the others in ways that were designed to please both fandoms simultaneously. The episode ran an hour, double the standard Family Guy length, and was the most watched Family Guy episode in more than a decade, pulling in 10 million viewers for its initial broadcast. It was, in many ways, the crossover event that fans had wanted. But it was also, by most critical assessments, a somewhat awkward affair. The specific tonal distance between the two shows' approaches to character and comedy was harder to bridge than a single episode could fully manage, and the episode's attempts to make the two universes feel genuinely compatible produced moments that were funny and moments that felt forced in roughly equal measure. The Peter and Homer dynamic worked. The Brian and Santa's Little Helper subplot was less satisfying. The Stewie and Bart pairing generated genuine entertainment. The resolution was brisk in ways that left some character threads underdeveloped. A second crossover has been discussed over the years since 2014, but has not happened as of the writing of this script. The first one demonstrated both the appeal and the difficulty of bridging the two shows, and the appetite for a second crossover, while genuine among fans, competes with the practical challenges of coordinating two separate productions that have their own schedules and their own institutional priorities. The Bob's Burgers crossover that many fans have hoped for, the two shows share a Sunday night presence in animation domination and are in some ways natural comedic companions. Both being shows about working-class families navigating domestic life with humor and genuine warmth, has been discussed publicly by people associated with both shows but has not been produced. The shows occupy adjacent but distinct comedic territories. Bob's Burgers operates with a very specific emotional warmth that Family Guy's humor sometimes crowds out. Whether the two could share an episode without the respective tonal identities being compromised is a genuine creative question that the show's respective teams would have to work out. The most recent and most firmly planned spin-off project is the Stewie-focused series announced in March of 2026, which we have already touched on. A two-season order, co-created by MacFarlane with writer Kirker Butler, targeting a 2027 to 2028 premiere. This represents the first time in over a decade that a Family Guy spin-off has been formally greenlit, and it raises genuinely interesting questions about what version of Stewie the new show will center on. The character has been through enough evolution over 25 years that there are meaningfully different options available. The show could embrace the original evil genius Stewie and use the spin-off format to do things with him that the main series could not accommodate. It could continue the softer, more emotionally nuanced Stewie of the later seasons and build around his relationship with Brian and his exploration of his own identity. It could attempt to do both simultaneously, to integrate the darker original conception with the warmer, evolved version, in a way that the main series never quite managed to make coherent. Nobody outside the production knows. The announcement is recent enough that the show's creative direction is presumably still being developed. But the fact that it is happening at all, that there is enough creative appetite for the character, enough institutional belief in his potential, to support a spin-off after 25 years of the main series suggests that the Stewie universe is larger and more generative than even its long main series run has fully exhausted. The crossovers and spin-offs that almost existed, the ones that were discussed and not developed, represent a particular kind of loss that is different from the loss of shelved episodes or changed characters. They are the loss of entire worlds that were imagined and not built, the Cleveland in Virginia that never happened, the Quagmire show that never got a development deal, the Joe Swanson police procedural comedy that nobody ever formally proposed, but that you can imagine clearly enough from what the show demonstrated about the character. Each of these unmade spin-offs would have expanded the Griffin universe's footprint in ways that the universe's current shape does not contain. The world of Cog, Rhode Island is larger than the show that airs has ever fully mapped. That unmapped territory, the places the show could have gone and didn't, the characters who could have been centered and weren't, the stories that were conceived in someone's imagination and never made it past a development conversation, is part of the alternative history of a franchise that has always contained more possibilities than any single show could exhaust. Section 10. The Network Wars episodes. Fox killed. The relationship between Seth MacFarlane and Fox Broadcasting Company is one of the most interesting and most complicated creator-network relationships in the history of American television. It is a relationship built on mutual dependency, wrapped around mutual frustration. Fox needed MacFarlane in a very concrete sense. Family Guy was one of their longest-running and most globally valuable properties, generating revenue in reruns and streaming and merchandise that dwarfed what the first-run broadcast numbers could alone justify. American Dad was providing reliable Sunday night programming. MacFarlane's name on a project carried real commercial weight in the animation market that Fox occupied. He was not simply a valued producer. He was a significant component of the network's entertainment division identity. And MacFarlane needed Fox in an equally concrete sense, at least through the first 20-plus years of the show's life. The show lived on Fox. The infrastructure of Fox Productions supported it. The distribution machine of Fox Broadcasting put it in front of audiences in the scale that the show required. Whatever the complications of the relationship, it was the relationship that kept Family Guy on television. But relationships built on mutual necessity can sustain a great deal of tension, and the MacFarlane-Fox relationship sustained more than most. The tension was not primarily commercial, it was creative and political and occasionally deeply personal. MacFarlane is, by public record, a progressive political figure. He has been outspoken about his views on gun violence, on climate change, on the importance of science literacy and public discourse, on social justice issues. Fox, as a broadcasting entity, shares corporate lineage with Fox News, and Fox News' specific brand of right-wing political commentary has been the direct target of MacFarlane's public criticism on multiple occasions. The most direct expression of this tension came in 2021, when MacFarlane posted on social media that Tucker Carlson's commentary on Fox News made him wish Family Guy was on a different network. He compared his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage, both parties knowing it was not working, both parties unable or unwilling to separate cleanly. This was not a private grievance expressed in a closed room. This was the creator of one of Fox's flagship animated properties on public social media, saying he wanted out. But before that public expression came years of smaller and specific confrontations over content. The network's influence on what Family Guy could do was exercised in ways both formal and informal, through official standards and practices, processes, and through the more diffuse pressure of knowing what the network would and would not accept, and calibrating creative choices accordingly. The two banned episodes we discussed earlier, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein and Partial Terms of Endearment, are the most documented instances of this influence. But they were not the only ones. Fox's Standards and Practices Department was a persistent presence throughout the show's history. Notes about specific scenes, concerns about specific jokes, requests for modifications to dialogue that was considered too explicit, too politically provocative, too uncomfortable for the primetime audience that the network needed to service. Some of these notes were reasonable responses to genuine content concerns. Some of them were institutional reflexes, the application of broadcast standards that had been developed for a different era of television comedy to content that was deliberately operating in a different register. MacFarlane's response to network notes was, by his own account, and by the accounts of writers who worked in the room, generally resistant but strategically pragmatic. He understood that certain battles were worth fighting and certain battles were not. He pushed back on notes that he felt were compromising the show's identity in fundamental ways, and accepted notes that were asking for changes at the margins. The accumulated effect of this negotiation across many seasons was a show that was consistently more constrained than MacFarlane's original vision called for, but never so constrained that it stopped being recognizably itself. The 2007 Writers Guild of America strike generated the most acute and most public collision between MacFarlane and Fox. The Writers Guild went on strike in November of 2007, seeking better residuals for DVD and digital distribution, a dispute that was fundamentally about writers receiving fair compensation from the new revenue streams that were transforming the entertainment economy. MacFarlane was a vocal and active supporter of the strike. He joined the picket lines. He used his public platform to advocate for the writer's position. He made clear, in whatever ways he could make clear within the constraints of his contractual obligations, that he supported the labor action and that he expected the network to respect it. Fox responded to the strike's disruption of production by making a decision that MacFarlane found deeply objectionable. The network aired episodes of Family Guy that had already been completed before the strike began, doing so without MacFarlane's consent and against his explicit wishes. These were episodes that Fox had the contractual right to broadcast. They were completed, paid for, and the broadcast rights belonged to the network. MacFarlane did not have the legal standing to prevent their airing. But the act of broadcasting his show against his wishes, while he was standing on a picket line supporting the labor action that the airing of those episodes was being used to work around, was a violation of the creator-network relationship in a way that MacFarlane did not forget. The strike ended in February of 2008, and production resumed. But the episode is part of the permanent record of how Fox's institutional priorities and MacFarlane's creative and political commitments came into direct conflict, and how the resolution of that conflict prioritized the network's interests over the creators. It is a moment that helps explain why, years later, MacFarlane would describe his relationship with Fox as a failing marriage rather than a productive partnership. Fox's scheduling decisions also functioned as a form of implicit pressure on the show. The moves that Family Guy experienced across its broadcast history from Sunday at 9 to Sunday at 9:30, and eventually, the highly significant move from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights for the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season communicated network priorities in the language that television speaks most fluently. Sunday night was prime real estate. The animation domination block was Fox's most valuable branded programming night. Being part of that block meant you were a headliner. Being moved to Wednesday nights meant the opposite. The Wednesday night move came at a particularly interesting moment in the show's trajectory. The ratings had been declining for years. The audience that had once made Family Guy one of Fox's most valuable properties had been shrinking season by season in a way that was not reversible through any straightforward programming intervention. The show was cheaper to produce than most network content, which is why it continued to be economically viable despite the audience decline. But the Wednesday night move made the network's assessment of the show's current importance explicit in a way that no amount of renewal announcements could fully obscure. MacFarlane signed his deal with NBC Universal in 2020, reportedly around $200 million over 5 years, moving his production company away from Fox's orbit and into the Comcast ecosystem. His newer projects were being made for Peacock and other Comcast platforms. The Orville had moved from Fox to Hulu's predecessor. The Ted series was developed for Peacock. MacFarlane was building his future elsewhere, and Family Guy was the one remaining anchor keeping him formally tied to a network he had publicly said he wanted to leave. The April 2025 announcement of a 4-season mega deal extending Family Guy through its 30th anniversary in the 2028 to 2029 season, with Disney now in the picture as parent company following. The Disney-Fox merger represented the latest chapter in this long and complicated relationship. The show will continue. The business case for its continuation remains compelling. The economic machine that surrounds a 25-year-old franchise generates enough revenue from reruns, streaming, and merchandise to justify continued production, regardless of what the first-run Wednesday night ratings show. But the content that Fox killed across the show's history, the episodes that were shelved or modified or prevented from airing in their original form, represents the negative space of the show's archive. The episodes that exist are visible and documented and watchable. The episodes that don't exist, that were stopped at various stages of the production pipeline by the network's editorial authority, are present only as absences. Their outlines can be traced in the shape of the space they would have occupied if they had been allowed to continue. The network wars produced a version of Family Guy that was consistently slightly less than what MacFarlane wanted it to be, not dramatically less. Not so much less that the show became something unrecognizable, but less in the specific ways that a creator always knows when their vision has been trimmed and qualified by the institutional pressures of commercial broadcasting. The show on your screen is the show that the war produced. The show in MacFarlane's head is the one that didn't quite make it out. Section 11. The alternate ending universe. What the show could have been. This section is different from the others. Everything we have discussed up to this point has been grounded in documented history production records, interviews, broadcast history, critical accounts, the publicly available evidence of what actually happened. The student thesis film and the pitch pilot and the character Bible and the shelved episodes and the network conflicts and the cancellation and the extraordinary revival. All of it is real, all of it verifiable, all of it part of the actual historical record of one of American animation's most significant franchises. What follows is something different. It is analytical speculation, clearly labeled as such. It is an attempt to trace the alternate histories that were implicit in the specific decisions that shaped the show, to ask, honestly and carefully, what different choices might have produced. This kind of counterfactual analysis is inherently uncertain. It can only tell you what might have been, not what would have been. History is not a controlled experiment. You cannot run the same show through a different set of decisions and measure the outcome. But you can examine the specific pressure points where the show diverged from its original conception, understand what those divergences changed, and construct a reasoned picture of the alternative path. Consider first the question of the cancellation. What if Fox had not canceled Family Guy in 2002? This is the most obvious and the most consequential branching point in the show's history. Without the cancellation, the extraordinary revival story does not happen. The Adult Swim rerun phenomenon does not happen. The DVD sales that demonstrated dormant audience value do not happen. The industry lesson about the persistence of canceled shows' audiences, the lesson that changed how studios and networks thought about their libraries in the streaming era, does not happen in quite the same way. All of that is true, but what the cancellation also disrupted was the creative continuity of the show. MacFarlane has acknowledged that the constant instability of the show's first 3 seasons canceled once, renewed, then canceled again had a direct and documented effect on the writing room. Writers left when cancellation came because they had to find other work. When the show returned, the room was reconstituted with a different combination of people who brought different sensibilities. The specific chemistry of the original room, whatever it was that produced the specific tone and character dynamics of the first 3 seasons, could not be perfectly reconstructed. In the alternate history where Fox never cancels Family Guy, the show does not get the benefit of 3 years' distance and a massive Adult Swim audience and DVD market evidence of its own cultural resonance. But it also does not lose its original writing room. It continues from Season 3 to Season 4 without interruption, with the same writers who produced the original run continuing to develop the characters they had been living with since the beginning. In this timeline, the gradual darkening of Peter, the slow erosion of Brian's better qualities, the softening of Stewie, all processes that accelerated after the revival, might have been more effectively managed. The show might have evolved, but along a more controlled trajectory. There is a school of thought among longtime fans that the best version of Family Guy is one that ran for roughly 6 or 7 seasons total, that the original conception contained enough material for that duration, and that the show's subsequent trajectory represents the natural consequence of a story being sustained beyond its organic endpoint. In this reading, the ideal version of Family Guy is shorter than the version we got, tighter, more concentrated, and ends before the characters' flanderization and the writing room's increasing dependence on shock value have done their worst damage. In this alternate ending universe, the show finishes somewhere around 2004 or 2005 inches production terms, completing a narrative arc for the Griffin family that felt complete, that gave Peter and Lois and Brian and Stewie and Meg each something like a satisfying trajectory, rather than leaving them suspended indefinitely in the amber of a show that is still running in 2026 with no clear end in sight. This is a legitimately interesting alternative. The shows that are often considered among the greatest in television history, shows like The Wire and Breaking Bad and Arrested Development, are not the longest-running shows. They are the shows that knew when they were done, that managed their creative resources carefully enough to end at or near their peak, rather than continuing past the point where the creative engine had given everything it had. Family Guy, in an alternate version of its history where it was conceived and executed as a complete narrative rather than an indefinitely renewable franchise, might have achieved something closer to that kind of concentrated excellence. Consider the question of what happens to the characters in this alternate history. Peter Griffin, if the show ended around season 6 or 7, would be remembered almost universally as a great comedic creation, the lovable idiot patriarch. The television dad whose specific combination of limitless confidence and limited intelligence generated situations of reliably escalating comedic absurdity. The later season's Peter, the one who became genuinely cruel, and whose behavior toward Meg and toward Joe and toward his own wife crossed the line from comedic incompetence into something that made audiences uncomfortable, does not exist in this alternate history. Peter stays Peter, the early Peter, the one that made people laugh rather than cringe. Brian Griffin, in this alternate version, finishes his run as the character he started as the voice of reason, the failed literary aspiration, the dog who wanted more than his circumstances could offer, and who found genuine friendship in the most improbable domestic arrangement. His arc, compressed into 6 or 7 seasons rather than extended across 25, might have resolved in a way that felt earned rather than simply stopping because the show continued past any point where his character had meaningful development left to do. The Brian who becomes insufferable in the later seasons, the hypocrite, the fraud, the political mouthpiece, is a product of indefinite continuation, of a character being written across more seasons than his original conception could sustain without distortion. The alternate Stewie is perhaps the most interesting case. In the shorter-run version of the show, the decision about what to do with Stewie's original character concept does not become the problem that it becomes in the long-run version. The writers of a 6-season show might have found a way to complete Stewie's arc in a manner that preserved his original menace while giving it a narrative resolution, perhaps a genuine confrontation between Stewie and Lois, that resolved their relationship in a way that allowed the character to grow beyond his original premise without simply abandoning it. The Stewie who gets to finish his story on its own terms, rather than being gradually softened into something unrelated to his original conception, might have been one of the great character completions in animated television history. Meg, in this alternate history, is perhaps the most significantly different from her broadcast version. The systematic abuse that Meg receives in the broadcast series accumulates across roughly 10 seasons, from the mild teasing of the original run, through the increasingly cruel humor of the middle seasons, to the point where her treatment becomes one of the defining uncomfortable features of the show. In a 6-season version of Family Guy, that arc simply doesn't happen. Meg is a normal, if somewhat overlooked teenager in a chaotic family, not a target of sustained, systematic cruelty. She is a character with potential for development that never quite gets developed, which is a different kind of failure from being turned into a punching bag but is at least not actively damaging. What about the alternate history in which MacFarlane stayed more fully invested in the show's creative direction? The version of the show in which he did not step back from active showrunning around 2011, in which the other projects that competed for his attention in the 2010s, the Ted films, the Orville, the NBC Universal deal did not pull him away from the daily management of Family Guy's creative direction? This is a genuinely difficult counterfactual because it requires imagining MacFarlane making professional choices that are inconsistent with the actual professional choices that his career trajectory and interests clearly demanded. He was going to make Ted. He was going to pursue the Orville. These were not random decisions. They were the expressions of creative ambitions that had been building throughout his career and that Family Guy's commercial success had made financially possible. But in the alternate timeline where he somehow manages to remain the active creative steward of the show while also pursuing these other projects where he finds a way to maintain the quality control that his presence in the room provided to prevent the worst of the character flanderization and the shock value escalation, to keep the show closer to its original tonal calibration, the show that results is meaningfully better than the broadcast version from around season 8 onward. Not perfect. The creative fatigue of sustaining a show across many seasons would still have taken its toll. The writing room churn would still have introduced voices that were pulling in different directions from the original vision, but the floor would have been higher. The worst of the later season's decisions, the decisions that produced the Brian who lets a woman drown because she was unavailable for him to date, the Peter who physically abuses his daughter for laughs, the Conway Twitty gags that lasted 3 minutes and had no punchline, might have been caught and corrected before they made it to broadcast. The alternate ending universe contains many different versions of Family Guy. Some are shorter, some are more fully realized. Some ended while the characters were still the people they started as. All of them are, in different ways, closer to the show that existed fully formed in Seth MacFarlane's imagination before the process of making television did what that process always does. We live in the timeline where Family Guy ran for 25 plus seasons, got renewed through its 30th anniversary, moved to Wednesday nights, and became simultaneously one of the most profitable and most critically debated animated franchises in American history. That timeline has its own genuine greatness, the early seasons that are as good as anything in animated comedy, the individual later episodes that still demonstrate what the show is capable of, the characters at their best who remain among the most recognizable in American television history. But the alternate ending universe is there too, running alongside the one we got, containing the versions of the show that were closer to the original vision, shorter, sharper, more completely themselves. The Family Guy that was never quite made, visible in the space between what the show was at its best and what it might have been if every decision that shaped it had gone differently. Section 12. The legacy of the version we never got. There is a particular kind of loss that belongs specifically to creative work. It is different from other losses. When a building is demolished, you can look at photographs of what it was. When a species goes extinct, you have the biological record. When a person dies, you have their history and the people who love them and the things they made while they were here. But when a creative vision is only partially realized, when what exists is not the version that was fully imagined but a series of approximations, compromises, and institutional adjustments, the original is harder to recover because it never fully existed in the physical world to begin with. It was inside somebody's head. It is still there, probably, though that head is older now and occupied with other things. It cannot be photographed, it cannot be archived. It can only be traced in the way that geologists trace ancient coastlines from the evidence they left in rock formations, not directly visible, but legible to the trained eye that knows what to look for. The version of Family Guy that was never quite made, the version that lived fully in Seth MacFarlane's imagination before the network got involved, and before the cancellation scattered the room, and before the revival changed the calculus, and before 25 years of commercial television production did what commercial television production does to every vision it touches. That version has left its own geological evidence in the show that aired. You can trace it in the first 3 seasons, where the creative vision is most concentrated and least diluted. You can see it in the specific way the Griffin family loved each other, despite their chaos in those early years. The quality that distinguishes a dysfunctional family from a toxic one, the warmth underneath the wreckage that made you want to spend time with these people instead of fleeing from them. You can see it in Brian's specific combination of failed ambition and genuine loyalty, the texture of a character who felt like someone you might actually know. You can see it in the early Stewie's precise menace, in the comedic craft of the cutaway gags when they were still earning their place in the narrative rather than replacing it, in the specific blend of dark and warm that the best episodes of those first 3 seasons maintain with a consistency that the later seasons could never quite recapture. The legacy of the version we never got is inseparable from the legacy of the version we did get. Family Guy is, inescapably, one of the most consequential animated programs in the history of American television. That is not a provisional assessment. It is not something that needs to be qualified or hedged. The show premiered in 1999 and reached 22 million viewers on its first night. It was canceled and came back from the dead through a mechanism, DVD sales and cable rerun ratings, demonstrating dormant audience value that changed how the television industry thought about its relationship to canceled properties, and that contributed directly to the streaming era's understanding of library value. It generated one of the most significant labor relations moments in animation history, contributing to the Writers Guild actions that ultimately improved working conditions for television writers. It launched a spin-off universe that included The Cleveland Show, American Dad, and the forthcoming Stewie series. It produced individual episodes Brian and Stewie, The Stewie Kills Lois 2-parter, Road to the Multiverse, Multiple Road 2, episodes that stand among the best work in animated television, regardless of the show's overall trajectory. It influenced an entire generation of animated comedy. The specific rhythms of Family Guy's humor, the callback cutaway, the extended awkward pause, the character who acknowledges the show's internal logic while commenting on it became part of the vocabulary of American animation in ways that are now so thoroughly absorbed into the form that they are difficult to isolate as. Specifically, Family Guy's contribution. Shows that came after it, that built on its innovations or reacted against them, were shaped by its presence in the cultural landscape in ways both direct and indirect. It is impossible to imagine the animated comedy landscape of the 2000s and 2010s without it. Seth MacFarlane himself carries the legacy of the version he never quite got to make. He is in an unusual position. He is the voice of characters he created 27 years ago, lending his voice to Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire episode after episode as the show continues past its 30th anniversary, voicing characters who are in many ways significantly different from the characters he originally conceived. There is something in that position that resists simple description. He created them. He voices them. They have been through more than he originally imagined for them, some of it better than he planned and some of it worse. They are his, and they are not entirely his anymore, in the specific way that creative work becomes not entirely the creator's once it has been given to the world. The American Dad comparison, which has been made throughout this script and which deserves a final consideration here, illuminates something essential about what the version we never got would have required to exist. American Dad maintained something across its long run that Family Guy gradually lost: the sense that the people running the show cared specifically about what the show was, not just about filling 22 minutes of animation per episode. The characters in American Dad evolved but did not become unrecognizable. The show's warmth was protected rather than steadily eroded. The specific identity of the program, its tonal signature, its comedic approach, its sense of what it was trying to do remained coherent across a run that now extends past 2 decades. That coherence required active protection. It required people in the room who understood what they were protecting and why it mattered. Family Guy at its best seasons 1 through approximately 4, with individual brilliant episodes scattered across the seasons beyond that, had that coherence. It had a sense of what it was trying to be and a creative infrastructure capable of realizing it. The version of the show that MacFarlane originally conceived had that coherence in its most complete form. The 25-year broadcast version retained it inconsistently brilliantly in some seasons, barely at all in others. What the show's long history makes unmistakably clear is that the version we never got is not simply a theoretical abstraction, not just the product of nostalgic longing for the show to have been something other than it was. It was real once. It existed in the first 3 seasons in a form close enough to the original vision that you can feel the vision operating inside it, shaping its choices, giving it the specific quality that makes those seasons rewatchable in a way that most of the later seasons are not. The original version is there in those early episodes, visible if you know what you are looking at. It did not vanish completely when the network pressures and the institutional forces and the creative drift began to accumulate. It was compressed, qualified, modified, but it was not extinguished. And that means, and this matters, in the way that these things matter even when they seem like merely theoretical consolations, that the version we never fully got also contains the possibility of being more fully recovered. Not by reversing 25 years of broadcast history, which is obviously impossible, but by the people who care about what Family Guy was at its best and what it might still be, making the specific choices that would move it back toward those original qualities. Choosing character complexity over character reduction, choosing warmth over cruelty, choosing the joke that earns its discomfort through craft over the joke that just shows you something extreme and waits for a reaction, choosing to give Meg a story instead of giving her another round of abuse, choosing to let Brian be genuinely intelligent again rather than merely pretentious. Choosing, in other words, to care about whether the show is good rather than merely whether it continues. Whether those choices will be made, whether the Stewie spinoff will reach back toward what made him original, whether the remaining main series seasons will find something worth saying, whether the people currently running the show understand well enough what made it great to protect that quality as the show approaches its 30th anniversary is something nobody outside the production can say with confidence. But the possibility exists. The template is there. In those first 3 seasons, fully formed and waiting to be re-engaged with. The Family Guy that was never quite made is the best version of the show, the one that existed entirely in one person's imagination before the world got involved. But the closest approximation of it that ever made it to the screen is still there, watchable and brilliant, and full of the specific energy of something being made by people who cared about making it well. That version deserves to be remembered for what it was. And that is why we are here tonight. In whatever quiet corner of the world you have found yourself in, talking about the version of the show that got away, the $50,000 pitch pilot, and the 15-minute thesis film, and the character Bible in one man's head, and the first 3 seasons that almost gave you the whole thing. That is where the original Family Guy lives. Not on Wednesday nights on Fox, competing with whatever else the network has determined belongs alongside it. Not in the Wednesday night ratings reports. Not in the merchandise revenue calculations or the Disney licensing agreements. It lives in the early episodes, in the specific quality that you recognize immediately when you go back and watch them, the specific combination of smart and warm and funny and occasionally genuinely dark that the show achieved when it was most completely itself. It was extraordinary. Some of it still is. The version we never got was even better. And somewhere in Los Angeles, a man who drew pictures by himself in a kitchen for 6 months in 1997 and 1998 to bring it to life probably knows that better than anyone. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If this video found you somewhere quiet, somewhere restful, somewhere you needed something to ease you towards sleep, I hope it did that. Drop a comment and tell me what you thought. And if you have not subscribed yet, that button is right there and it means a great deal to this channel. Every subscriber is someone who found their way here and decided to stay. And that is something I do not take for granted. Until next time, wherever you are, sleep well. Expansion. Deeper into the origin. The years that shaped the vision. There is more to say about Seth MacFarlane's formative years, and the saying of it matters not as biographical filler but as genuine explanatory context for why the show took the specific shape it did. Kent, Connecticut, in the 1970s and 1980s, was a very specific kind of American place. Not a big city, not a suburb in the continuous suburban sprawl sense that characterizes so much of American residential geography. A small town, genuinely small, a few thousand people embedded in the Litchfield Hills of northwestern Connecticut, surrounded by the particular quality of New England autumn that arrives with a consistency and a drama that people from other parts of the country fly to New England specifically to experience. It is the kind of place where you know your neighbors and your neighbors know you, where the rhythms of local life have a legibility that larger communities lose, where the texture of ordinary American existence is visible in a way that density and anonymity obscure. Growing up in a place like that, with a television set receiving whatever the major broadcast networks were offering in those years, shapes a certain relationship to popular culture. You are close enough to it to be shaped by it, and far enough from its production centers that it retains some of the quality of magic arriving from somewhere else, made by people you cannot imagine knowing, existing in a space that seems entirely different from the one you occupy. MacFarlane absorbed American popular culture from that specific vantage point. The Honeymooners reruns that he identified as a major influence on his character sensibility. The Hanna-Barbera cartoons that he watched with the analytical attention that would later translate into professional understanding. The radio comedy traditions that he absorbed through his parents' and grandparents' tastes, and that would eventually show up in Brian Griffin's martini-drinking intellectual affect, and in the show's occasional flights of jazz-era reference humor. The Rhode Island School of Design years deepened and systematized what had been developing informally since childhood. RISD is not a school that tolerates vagueness about one's own artistic intentions. The culture of serious art and design education demands that you know what you are doing and why you are doing it, that you can articulate your aesthetic choices, defend your creative decisions, and demonstrate that your work is the product of genuine thought rather than accidental facility. MacFarlane arrived at RISD already knowing what he wanted to make. The training sharpened his understanding of why those things worked, and that sharper understanding is visible in the specific craft of the early Family Guy episodes, in the way the humor is structured, in the way the character dynamics are calibrated, in the way the cutaways function at their best as genuine comedic architecture rather than merely random interruptions. There is also the question of the comedy traditions that MacFarlane was absorbing during his 20s, the years between RISD and the Family Guy premiere, when he was working in professional animation while developing the show on the side. He has spoken in interviews about his deep affection for the comedians and writers and performers of the mid-20th century, for Bob Hope's specific technique, for the timing of Jack Benny, for the observational intelligence of Johnny Carson, for the satirical precision of the best early Saturday Night Live writing. These are not obscure reference points. They are the established canon of American comedy, the tradition that any serious student of the form would need to understand. But MacFarlane's engagement with them was not merely studious. He genuinely loved this material. He could perform it. He was himself, by the time Family Guy premiered, a singer of genuine accomplishment in the big band and jazz standard tradition that these earlier comedians had inhabited as a natural part of their professional world. That love for mid-century American entertainment, for the specific combination of wit and warmth and craft that the best of it achieved, is visible in Family Guy at its best in ways that the show's reputation for transgressive humor sometimes obscures. The show is remembered for its edginess, its willingness to go to dark places, its specific brand of provocative comedy that made it controversial enough to be listed as one of the worst shows on television by the Parents Television Council for multiple consecutive years. And all of that is real. But underneath the transgression, there is a bedrock of genuine affection for a certain kind of American comedy craft, for the well-constructed joke, for the comic callback, for the character-driven humor that builds from who someone is rather than merely from what they say. The show at its best is a show that is trying to be genuinely funny in a way that the best American comedians of the 20th century would have recognized as legitimate craft. The transgression is in service of that aim, not a replacement for it. When the transgression became the point rather than the delivery system, when the shock was the joke rather than the setup for a better joke, is precisely when the show began to lose the quality that made it special. That transition is the transition from the original vision to the compromised version. It is the transition from a show that was trying to do something specific and doing it with genuine craft to a show that had forgotten what it was originally trying to do and was filling the space with whatever generated a reaction. Understanding that transition requires understanding what the original vision actually was, and the clearest articulation of it is not in any interview or any published account, but in the early episodes themselves. In the specific quality of the humor and the character work and the family dynamics of the first 3 seasons. That is the document. Not the character Bible, not the pitch pilot, not the student thesis film, though all of those are valuable evidence. The primary document is the show at its best, in the form that most fully realized the original intention before the institutional forces of commercial television began their patient work of qualification and dilution. What was that original intention? To make people laugh at something true, to find comedy in the specific texture of working-class American domestic life, in the specific dynamics of a family that loved each other more than it managed to demonstrate, in the specific absurdity of a world in which an infant genius and a talking literary dog were unremarkable enough features of daily life that nobody thought to address them directly. To take the archetype of the lovable American family, the archetype that had been generating comedy on American television since before television was a mass medium, since the radio days, since the stage comedy that preceded the radio, and push it into territory that the archetype's original designers would not have recognized, making it stranger and darker and funnier, without losing the warmth that gave the archetype its durability in the first place. That was the original intention. It is visible in the show's best work. And the version of the show that most fully realized it is the version that partly got away. Expansion, the animation that breathed how the show looked before it became efficient. One of the least discussed but most consequential aspects of the version of Family Guy that existed in its earliest form is the specific quality of the animation itself, the way the show looked and moved in its first 3 seasons, and the specific relationship between that visual quality and the humor the show was trying to generate. Animation is not merely the medium through which comedy is delivered. It is part of the comedy. The timing of an animated joke is inseparable from the timing of the animation that executes it. The way a character's face moves through an expression, the specific path that a physical gag takes from setup to punchline, the energy with which a background character reacts to the main action of a scene, all of these are animation decisions that affect whether a joke works or doesn't, whether the audience laughs or doesn't, whether the show feels alive or feels mechanical. The animation of the first 3 seasons of Family Guy has a specific quality that fans who have been watching the show since the beginning consistently identify as something that was lost when the show returned from its cancellation-era hiatus. It is not a matter of technical quality. The later seasons are, in many purely technical senses, more polished than the early ones. The character models are cleaner, the lines are more consistent, The production pipeline produces a more technically standardized product. But technical polish and animation vitality are not the same thing. They are, in fact, in some tension with each other. The early Family Guy was animated with what professionals in the industry sometimes describe as expressiveness, a willingness to let characters' faces and bodies move in ways that went slightly beyond the model sheet. Specifications? That allowed the animator's own interpretive energy to show up in the finished product. Rough Draft Studios, which handled seasons 2 and 3, brought a particular sensibility to the show. Their work had a looseness that gave the characters a physical warmth, a sense that they occupied space and moved through it with something like physical reality, rather than merely traversing the clean vector paths of a more rigidly constrained production. The Peter Griffin of Season 2 and Season 3 has a physical energy that the Peter Griffin of Season 8 onward does not quite have. He is present in his scenes in a different way, occupying the frame differently, his physical reactions to the situations around him carrying a charge that the later, more technically consistent animation sometimes flattens. This matters for the version of the show that was never fully made because the original conception of Family Guy's humor was deeply visual in ways that the cutaway-dependent later seasons were not. MacFarlane's training at RISD was visual training. His instinct for comedy was shaped partly by watching animation, by absorbing the specific visual language of the Hanna-Barbera tradition. The way that physical comedy in animation works differently from physical comedy in live action. The specific grammar of cartoon expressiveness that communicates character information through extreme physical reactions and impossibly elastic faces. The show he conceived was one in which the animation would be doing genuine comedic work, not just executing jokes that the script had written, but contributing its own layer of meaning to the humor, the way that great physical comedy always generates, meaning that the words alone cannot produce. Some of that original visual comedy survived into the broadcast series and thrived in it. The Peter and Giant Chicken fights recurring operatic battle sequences in which Peter and a man in a chicken costume fight each other across increasingly elaborate locations in scenes that escalate far beyond the original. Premise's scope are among the most beloved recurring bits in the show's history precisely because they allow the animation to do something that the dialogue-heavy comedy of the rest of the show cannot do. They are pure animated spectacle, and they are great animated spectacle choreographed and executed with a genuine investment in the visual comedy of two characters destroying their environment in progressively more destructive ways. But outside of those spectacular set pieces, the animation of the later seasons settled into a functional efficiency that served the show's production requirements without always serving its comedic ambitions. The cutaway-heavy structure that dominated the post-revival seasons placed different demands on the animation you needed to be able to produce a large number of short, self-contained visual gags rather than animating the longer scenes of character interaction that the original show had built around. That structural shift in the writing had a corresponding structural shift in the animation. The show became better at producing large quantities of serviceable animation and less invested in producing smaller quantities of exceptional animation. The version of the show that existed in MacFarlane's original conception was a more visually ambitious production than the show that the broadcast series consistently realized. The animation was meant to be doing more comedic work. The characters were meant to be more fully embodied in their physical comedy. The visual grammar of the show was meant to be a genuine contributor to the humor rather than a delivery system for jokes that had been written without specific visual requirements. That ambition was realized in the best moments of the early seasons. It was gradually deprioritized as the production scaled up, and the cutaway format made different demands on the animation pipeline. The version we never got, in this specific dimension, was a show in which every scene was designed with the animation in mind, as a genuine comedic tool, where the writers were writing for what the animators could do rather than writing for dialogue and description, and trusting the animators to competently execute whatever the script required. That collaboration between writing and animation, the kind of collaboration that produces the best moments in any animated comedy, is visible in the show's best work and is missing from its weakest. Expansion. What Brian Griffin was meant to be. Brian Griffin deserves more space than any single section of this script has given him, because Brian is perhaps the character whose divergence from his original conception is most illuminating about the overall trajectory of the show. The Brian who appears in The Life of Larry as Steve, and who reappears in the Larry and Steve short as a more developed version of the same character, is a creature of pure comic contrast. He is an animal, a dog, with all the physical and behavioral characteristics that being a dog entails, who thinks and speaks and moves through the world with the full apparatus of an educated human intelligence. The comedy of Steve and of the early Brian comes entirely from that contrast. You do not need to do anything else with the character. The premise is so complete, so generative of comic situations, so naturally productive of the specific humor that comes from watching sophisticated consciousness navigate an unsophisticated physical existence, that you could build an entire show around it without ever exhausting its possibilities. MacFarlane understood this. He understood it in the Larry shorts, and he built it into the Family Guy character Bible, with the full weight of someone who had been thinking about this character for years before anyone else ever encountered him. The Brian he presented to Fox was not simply the smart dog, a lazy description that reduces the character to his single most obvious quality. The Brian in MacFarlane's conception was a person with a complete interior life, with a history and a set of ongoing concerns and a relationship to his own ambitions and limitations that generated material the show could explore in ways that were not merely variations on the same contrast joke. He was a writer, not a successful one. This was the crucial distinction, the specific quality that gave the character his particular emotional texture. Brian wanted to be taken seriously as a literary figure. He had the aspiration, and he had some portion of the talent, and he had read the books, and he had the opinions, and he had the specific sensitivity that literary aspiration requires. What he did not have was the capacity to translate all of that into work that actually fulfilled the promise of the aspiration. His novel was never finished. His plays were not produced. The things he wrote were not good enough to achieve what he wanted them to achieve, and he knew this. The character's intelligence was sufficient to make him aware of the gap between what he was reaching for and what he was able to grasp. That specific quality, the aspiration that exceeds the execution, the intelligence that is acute enough to recognize its own limitations, is one of the most humanly relatable things in all of the early show. It is what made Brian the character that people connected with most personally, that people saw themselves in most directly. Not the talking dog aspect, obviously. The specific experience of wanting to achieve something that your best efforts are not quite equal to, of being smart enough to understand what the thing would look like if you could achieve it, but not quite smart enough, or not quite talented enough, or not quite disciplined enough, or not quite courageous enough to actually produce it. That is the human condition in a very specific and recognizable way, and Brian embodied it with a precision that the show's early seasons handled with real compassion alongside the comedy. The version of Brian that MacFarlane originally conceived would have sustained that specific quality across the show's run. The intelligent animal in an inadequate physical situation, trying to write the great American novel and never quite finishing it, falling in love with women who were wrong for him and understanding why they were wrong and falling anyway, maintaining the friendship with Peter that was the warmest and most unlikely thing in his life, being the one member of the household who could look at what was happening around him clearly enough to say something true about it even when nobody was listening. That character existed fully in the first few seasons. He was genuinely funny and genuinely sad and genuinely the character you were most likely to identify with if you were an adult watching the show. His evolution across the later seasons into the hypocrite and the mouthpiece, and eventually into the character who lets a woman drown because she is unavailable for him to date, is the most complete and the most heartbreaking instance of a show destroying something valuable that it had built. Because Brian was built right, he was built carefully, and with genuine understanding of what made him work. And the show, across enough seasons, managed to dismantle everything that made him work and replace it with something that generated the opposite of the response the character was originally designed to produce. The original Brian the Brian in MacFarlane's intention and in the show's best early episodes was someone you rooted for. The later Brian is someone you root against. That transformation is not the natural consequence of 25 years of character development. It is the consequence of specific writing decisions, specific choices about what to do with the character in each season that accumulated into something that bears almost no relationship to what was originally there. The version we never got would have kept rooting for Brian, would have let him finish the novel, maybe, or would have let him accept that he wasn't going to finish it in a way that was funny and sad and true rather than just sad. would have let the relationship with Peter remain the show's warmest and most unlikely friendship, rather than becoming one of many character relationships that the show's later treatment of Brian made uncomfortable. Would have honored what the character was when he was most fully himself. Expansion, the writer's room that made the early magic. The people who were in the room when Family Guy first found its voice deserved to be named and their contributions acknowledged, because the specific chemistry of that early writing room is as important to understanding what the original show was as anything MacFarlane himself brought to it. Chris Sheridan was among the first writers hired and contributed to the specific comedic voice of the early episodes in ways that are traceable in the style of the humor. Danny Smith wrote episodes across the early run that captured the particular blend of dark and warm that the show at its best maintained with real consistency. Gary Janetti brought a specific sensibility that the show drew on. Neil Goldman and Garrett Donovan worked as a writing team whose episodes are among the most fondly remembered by fans of the original run. Mike Barker, who would go on to co-create American Dad with MacFarlane, was part of the original group. What united these writers, across the diversity of their individual backgrounds and sensibilities, was a shared understanding of what the show was trying to do and a commitment to doing it with genuine craft. The early Family Guy writing room was not a room of people who were there to produce content. It was a room of people who were there to write comedy, who had opinions about what was funny and what wasn't, who pushed back on ideas that weren't working even when they came from the creator, who maintained the quality standard not because it was formally mandated, but because the people in the room cared enough about the show to police it themselves. That culture of genuine care about quality is what the room's later iterations, after the cancellation and the revival, and the inevitable turnover of personnel across 20-plus years of production, struggled to fully reconstitute. Not because the later writers were less talented, the show over its long run employed many very talented comedy writers. But the specific shared understanding of what the show was, the instinctive feel for when something was on brand and when it was drifting, when a joke was earning its darkness and when it was just being dark, when the character work was building towards something and when it was simply recycling, the same beats that shared understanding is not easily reconstructible. Once the original group that built it has dispersed, the cancellation dispersed them. Not all of them permanently, some returned for the revival and beyond. But the specific composition of the room, the specific combination of sensibilities that had produced those first 3 seasons, never fully reassembled. What the revival produced was a different room, talented, capable, responsible for some excellent individual episodes across the post-revival run, but a different room. The specific magic of the original was something that had emerged from a specific combination of people at a specific moment, and that combination, like most creative chemistry of that kind, was not reproducible by design. This is not a criticism of the later writers. It is a structural observation about how creative chemistry works. You cannot mandate the emergence of a shared artistic vision. You can hire talented people and give them good resources and create a productive working environment. But the specific thing that made the early Family Guy room produce the early Family Guy episodes was a combination of factors that included the specific people, the specific moment, the specific hunger that comes from a show that is still proving itself, and the specific guiding presence of a creator who understood every aspect of what he was making and why. When any of those factors change, and across 25 years, all of them change, the show that results reflects those changes. The version of Family Guy that was most fully itself was the version produced by that specific early room in those first 3 seasons, when everyone involved was most completely in alignment about what they were building. That alignment is the most perishable thing in any creative enterprise, and the most irreplaceable when it is gone. The $50,000 miracle and what it produced. It is worth spending more time with the specific conditions under which the pitch pilot was made, because those conditions shaped what the pilot was in ways that are not fully appreciated when you simply note that the budget was $50,000 and move on. $50,000 is a very small amount of money to make an animated film. To produce 16 minutes of animation at a professional level, with character designs that would need to be production ready for series use, with voice performances that would establish how these characters sounded for potentially many years of production, with comedic timing precise enough to make the case to network executives that the humor of the concept actually worked $50,000, forces a set of creative choices that a more generously funded production would not have needed to make. MacFarlane made those choices with an intelligence born of deep understanding of what actually mattered. He prioritized the things that could not be compromised, the voice performances, the character dynamics, the comedic rhythm, and he accepted limitations in the things that could be addressed later if the pilot was successful. The animation in the pitch pilot is rougher than the broadcast series animation. The visual design is less polished. The backgrounds are simpler. These were not failures of craft. They were the correct prioritization of a creator who understood that a network executive watching a 16-minute pitch film is making an assessment of the concept, the characters, and the humor, not of the production quality, which will improve dramatically with a real series budget. The 6 months that MacFarlane spent producing the pilot alone in his apartment is a period of creative concentration that has an almost mythological quality to it in the history of the show's development. 6 months of nearly uninterrupted work, by his own account. No social life to speak of. The specific, focused isolation of someone who is making something and knows that the making of it is the only thing that matters right now. The voices that he developed for Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire during those months were being worked out in real time in an empty apartment. MacFarlane talking to himself, adjusting accents and rhythms and emotional registers, finding the specific sound of each character through the kind of iterative private performance that actors do before auditions and that voice artists do before recording sessions, except that MacFarlane was doing it across 6 months rather than 6 hours. The voices that emerged from that process are so completely associated with their characters that it is genuinely difficult to imagine any of them sounding different. Peter's specific Rhode Island accent, the way it rounds certain vowels and drops certain consonants, the specific quality of good-natured dimness that MacFarlane built into the vocal performance. Brian's slightly elevated register, the faint suggestion of an East Coast education that gives his voice its specific authority even when what Brian is saying does not entirely warrant the authority. Stewie's Rex Harrison-derived clipped British delivery, the precision of the diction that makes the contrast with his physical circumstances funnier by being more extreme. These voices are the show. Not the only thing that makes the show what it is, but among the most essential. The show would not have worked with different voices for these characters in the way that it works with these ones. The specific chemistry between the performances, the way Peter's open vowels and Brian's crisp consonants and Stewie's precise diction and Quagmire's specific vocal energy create a particular sonic texture when they are in scenes together is part of what makes the show's best moments work as well as they do. All of that was developed in a kitchen in Los Angeles on $50,000 and 6 months of focused solitude. The pilot that emerged from those conditions was rough in certain technical respects and absolutely precise in the respects that mattered most. It was precise about who these characters were and how they sounded and how they related to each other. It was precise about the specific flavor of the humor, the blend of domestic comedy and dark absurdism and pop cultural reference that would define the show's approach. It was precise about the emotional register of the family's relationships, the warmth underneath the dysfunction, the love underneath the chaos that made the Griffins worth spending time with even at their most ridiculous. Fox watched the pilot and ordered the series. The order was, by all accounts, not a close decision. The executives who watched it recognized something that was ready to be a show. The $50,000 had produced something that $1 million of standard pilot development had often failed to produce: a genuine point of view, clearly articulated, fully formed, ready for the screen. That point of view, the specific creative vision, that $50,000 in 6 months, and everything that MacFarlane had been building towards since childhood, produced in concentrated form, is the version of Family Guy that was most completely itself. The version we never quite got is the version that would have kept that point of view at its center across every decision, every season, every writer's room conversation, every network note. The version where that original concentrated vision remained the standard against which every subsequent choice was measured. The show at its best came closest to that standard. The show in its later seasons measured against it poorly. The pilot and the early seasons are the record of what was intended. Everything else is the history of what happened to it. Expansion. Voices in the booth. The human performances inside the cartoon. The voice performances in Family Guy are among the most consistently excellent aspects of the show. and they deserve examination as a distinct contribution to understanding what made the original version of the show work as well as it did, and what has continued to work even as other elements have degraded. MacFarlane himself voices four of the show's most important characters: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, which is an extraordinary workload for a single performer and one that requires a level of vocal range and stamina that is genuinely uncommon. The specific requirement of maintaining four distinct character voices at broadcast quality across hundreds of episodes, each character requiring different technical and emotional approaches, is a professional achievement that tends to be under-acknowledged in discussions of the show's creative contributions. Peter's voice is the most technically demanding in certain respects because it requires the most specific regional and class coding. The Rhode Island working-class accent that MacFarlane developed for the character is not a generic American accent. It is a specific dialect geographically placed, demographically situated, historically particular to a slice of New England working-class experience that most of the show's national and international audience would not have specific personal familiarity with. MacFarlane maintains that specificity across thousands of episodes. The voice never drifts into generic American or into caricature. It remains precisely itself, which is the kind of sustained precision that casual listeners do not notice, but that is actually the product of real vocal discipline. Brian's voice is, in some ways, the most sophisticated of the four MacFarlane characters, because it requires the most nuanced emotional range. Brian is the character who has the most complex interior life, who goes through the most varied emotional states across episodes, whose specific combination of intelligence and inadequacy requires the performer to communicate both simultaneously without either canceling out the other. When Brian is at his best in the early seasons, genuinely thoughtful, genuinely funny, genuinely sad, in the specific way that a character whose aspirations exceed his achievements is sad, it is because the performance is making the interior life legible through sound, in a way that the best voice acting always does. Alex Borstein's Lois is a performance that deserves recognition as one of the most underappreciated in American animated television. The character of Lois could easily have been a one-note supportive wife, the straight woman against Peter's comedy, a function more than a person. Borstein gives her something more, a specific quality of patience that has its limits, of warmth that can curdle into exasperation, of genuine intelligence that makes her relationship with Peter's limited intelligence a source of real comedy rather than merely a setup for his jokes. The Lois of the early seasons is a fully rounded person, in a way that the later seasons, which began to use her primarily for reaction shots and increasingly allowed her own character to drift in less consistent directions, did not always maintain. Mila Kunis's Meg, who took over the role from Lacey Chabert after the first season, is a performance that is in some ways thankless in the way that the role became across the show's run. Kunis voiced a character who was increasingly being written as a target rather than a person, and the dignity she maintained in those performances, the quality of genuine emotional reality that she brought to Meg, even when the scripts were treating the character with casual cruelty, is something that deserves acknowledgement. The show did not always give Meg material worthy of the performance, but the performance was consistently better than the material required. Seth Green's Chris is the sleeper of the main cast, the performance that does something specific and underrated with a character who could easily have been nothing more than the other kid. Green found in Chris a particular quality of benign incomprehension, a genuine warmth without guile, a lack of awareness that reads as innocence rather than stupidity. The specific difference between innocence and stupidity is crucial for the character to work. Peter is the show's designated idiot, and Chris being a second version of the same joke would have been redundant. Green makes Chris something adjacent to Peter's stupidity but meaningfully different from it, and that distinction is the product of a careful performance rather than an obvious one. The voice cast is one of the elements of the show that has remained most consistent across the transition from the original run to the revival and through the subsequent 20-plus seasons of production. The character voices are still the voices they were in the pilot and the first season. That consistency across a cast that has aged and evolved and been through everything that 25 years of professional and personal life involves is itself a remarkable thing. It represents a continuity with the original version of the show that more perishable elements of the original vision have not always maintained. In the version of the show that was never fully made, The version that kept the original creative vision most completely intact, those voices would have been serving material as good as the best of the early seasons, consistently and across the show's entire run. The gap between what those performances are capable of, the emotional range, and the comic precision that the cast demonstrated most completely in the show's best episodes, and what the later scripts often asked of them is one of the most poignant losses in the history of a show that accumulated many losses over its long run. The performers were there the whole time. The show that was worthy of them was not always there with them. Expansion. What the show said about America, when it was saying something, Family Guy in its best seasons was doing something that the show's reputation for transgressive humor sometimes obscures. It was engaged in a genuine, if often irreverent, project of cultural observation. It was looking at a particular kind of American life, and finding in it both the comedy of recognition and the discomfort of honest appraisal. The Griffins are a working-class family in a way that most American primetime sitcom families are not. Peter works in a brewery in the later seasons. He works at the Pawtucket Patriot Ale Brewery. Having previously worked at a toy factory, and his professional identity is that of a blue-collar worker who drinks beer with his friends at the local bar and watches television in his free time, and does not have a great deal of cultural capital but has a great deal of genuine human warmth. Lois's family background is upper class. She is a Pewterschmidt by birth, from money that she has left behind to make a life with Peter, but her daily domestic reality is working class, and her navigation of that specific class position between the world she came from and the world she inhabits is a source of real comedy and occasional genuine insight in the early seasons. This class specificity is part of what grounded the show in its early life, and what drained away as the later seasons deprioritized character-based humor in favor of cutaway gags and shock comedy. A cutaway gag does not require you to know who your characters are at any deep level. A joke that emerges from the specific class position and specific personal history of Peter Griffin requires you to maintain a coherent understanding of who Peter Griffin is, and the maintenance of that coherence is what the Flanderization process gradually destroyed. The show at its best was also genuinely funny about the specific quality of American popular culture consumption in the early 2000s, about the specific relationship that working-class Americans had with television and movies and music and the other cultural products that were arriving, in an accelerating stream through the cable box and the DVD player and the early internet. Peter's cultural references are specific to his demographic and his generation in ways that the show used for real comedy rather than merely for recognition humor. The jokes were not just, ha-ha, remember this. They were observations about the specific role that popular culture plays in the life of someone for whom it functions as a primary form of entertainment and social bonding and shared reference. That is a real thing about a real aspect of American life, and the show at its best engaged with it seriously as a subject, even while making it funny. The version of the show that was most fully itself, the version that existed in the early seasons and that the original conception had envisioned continuing, was a show with genuine things to say about the specific texture of American working-class domestic life at the turn of the 21st century. It was saying those things in the most entertainingly irreverent way possible, wrapped in dark humor and absurdist comedy, and the show's specific brand of transgression. But underneath the wrapping, there was genuine observation. There was genuine engagement with real human experience. That engagement, the quality of caring enough about what you are looking at to actually see it clearly, is what distinguishes the best comedy from the merely efficient. Family Guy at its best cared enough about the Griffins and their world to actually look at them. The later seasons, with their cutaway dependency and their shock value escalation and their increasingly unmoored character behavior, stopped looking. They stopped being interested in what was actually there and substituted for it the louder and more efficient entertainment of the spectacle. The version we never got would have kept looking, would have maintained the interest in what was actually happening with these characters and in their world, would have stayed engaged with the genuine human material at the center of the show and kept finding comedy in it rather than replacing it with something noisier and less true. That engagement is the deepest thing that the version we never got would have preserved. And it is the deepest thing that the version we have, at its intermittent best, still manages to recover. Expansion. The Adult Swim years and the audience that waited. There is something worth sitting with in the specific image of what Family Guy's audience was doing between February 2002 and April 2003. The show was canceled. New episodes were not being made. The writers were gone. The voice cast was working on other projects. Seth MacFarlane was developing other ideas, continuing his career, moving forward in the way that anyone in the professional world moves forward when the specific project they were working on comes to an end. The institutional reality of Family Guy was that it was over, and yet its audience was still there. Not in the formal, measurable sense that broadcast ratings capture. There were no new episodes to rate, no weekly slot to tune into, no regular appointment with new content. But the audience was there in the sense that matters more in the long run. They remembered the show, they talked about it, they recommended it to people who had not seen it, they held on to whatever physical media they could find that contained it. They were an audience without a show, which is one of the more poignant conditions that entertainment culture can produce. The specific nature of this audience matters to understanding the Family Guy story. It was not a passive audience that had simply watched a show and forgotten it. It was an active audience, the kind of audience that forms around work that genuinely means something to the people who encounter it, that generates the specific loyalty and the specific evangelical enthusiasm that turns viewers into advocates. Family Guy fans between 2002 and 2003 were not waiting politely. They were actively circulating the show, actively building the cult following that the Adult Swim rerun slot would eventually reveal had grown to enormous size. This is part of the story of the version of the show that was never quite made because the audience's memory of what they loved about the show, the specific qualities that had made it worth advocating for during the cancellation period, was a memory of the original version. The audience that brought Family Guy back from the dead was the audience of the first 3 seasons, the audience that had absorbed the show's original vision in its most concentrated form. When they demanded the show's return, they were demanding the return of that specific thing. The revival that eventually happened produced something somewhat different, as we have discussed throughout this script, and the gap between what the returning audience was hoping for and what the revived show actually delivered is part of the history of the version we never got. The Adult Swim period, between April 2003 and the beginning of Season 4 production, was also a period in which the show's cultural meaning was being actively renegotiated. Reruns on a cable network reach a different audience configuration from first-run episodes on a broadcast network. The Adult Swim audience was younger, more likely to be watching in the late hours of the night, more likely to be the college-aged demographic that would eventually become the show's most commercially valuable audience base. The specific comedy of the early Family Guy worked extremely well for this audience. The dark humor, the pop cultural references that assumed a certain generational position, the specific rhythms of the cutaway gags that were ideally suited to the way that late-night cable audiences engaged with content, often intermittently and with the television as ambient presence rather than primary focus. The show found its ideal audience during its cancellation. The audience that loved it most completely was the audience that discovered it in reruns rather than in first run, the audience that had been too young or too absent to find it during its original broadcast. That specific audience, young, digitally connected, culturally engaged, ready to circulate the show's best moments through the early video sharing platforms that were beginning to emerge in 2003 and 2004, is the audience that made the revival commercially inevitable. But it is also the audience whose specific tastes, whose specific preferences, whose specific understanding of what Family Guy was, would shape the revived show in ways that the original audience might not have chosen. The viral clip audience, the audience that would eventually circulate cutaway gags across YouTube and make individual 30-second moments into the primary unit of the show's cultural presence, is the audience that the post-revival seasons were most directly optimized for. The cutaway escalation, the shock value increase, the shift from story to spectacle, all of these can be understood partly as the show learning from and adapting to the specific engagement patterns of the audience that the Adult Swim period created. The audience that made the show possible again was, in some ways, the audience that changed it into something the original audience would not fully recognize. There is a complicated irony in that, and it is an irony that belongs specifically to the version of the show that was never quite made the version that the original audience was hoping for when they demanded the revival, and that they partially found and partially didn't in the seasons that followed. Expansion. The 30-year question: where do the Griffins go from here? Family Guy is approaching its 30th anniversary. The mega deal announced in April of 2025, extending the show through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, means that the show will be on the air for at least 30 years when the last episode under that deal airs. 30 years of the same characters, the same fictional New England town, the same family unit navigating the same domestic dynamics across a world that has changed enormously since 1999. That is a remarkable duration. It is longer than The Simpsons ran before Family Guy premiered. It approaches the longevity of long-running television institutions that most people think of as permanent fixtures of the cultural landscape rather than as shows with origins and histories and creators. The show has outlasted multiple generations of its own writers, multiple technology paradigms in broadcast television, multiple shifts in the comedic culture from which it emerged. What the 30th anniversary means for the version of the show that was never quite made is complex. On one level, it means that the original vision has been deferred indefinitely. There is no clear endpoint at which the show might arrive at something that feels like completion of the original creative intention, no season finale that might give the Griffin family a sense of resolution. The show will continue because the economics support its continuation, regardless of whether the creative material justifies it. On another level, the Stewie spin-off represents something genuinely interesting in this context. It is the first new creative investment in the show's universe in over a decade, the first indication that someone involved in the production believes there is something unexplored that is worth exploring. MacFarlane's involvement as co-creator, alongside writer Kirker Butler, suggests that this is not merely a corporate exploitation of an existing property, but a genuine creative initiative in which the show's originator has some investment. Whether the Stewie spin-off will reach back toward the original character concept, engaging with the specific genius of the evil infant villain that the main series gradually set aside, or whether it will continue forward with the evolved Stewie, the emotionally complex Brian companion, the identity-exploring adventurer is the most interesting, open, creative question in the franchise's current state. The choice will say something significant about how MacFarlane and the people currently running the show understand what made the show great and what still makes it worth making. The original vision of Family Guy, the one that existed most completely in the $50,000 pitch pilot and the first 3 broadcast seasons, is not entirely gone. It persists in the show's DNA, in the character designs that have not substantially changed in 25 years, in the voice performances that remain what they were in the beginning, in the occasional late-season episode that demonstrates that the writers still know how to make the show work when they are working from the original creative instincts, rather than from the accumulated habits of a long institutional production. The version of the show that was never quite made is, in the deepest sense, a standard. It is the measure against which the show that aired has always been implicitly judged by the people who loved the early seasons and by the creator who made them. Every episode that matches that standard is a recovery of something that had been set aside. Every episode that falls short of it is an accumulation of the distance between the original vision and the institutional product. The 30-year anniversary is an opportunity, not a guarantee. Anniversaries in commercial entertainment are as often occasions for reflexive celebration of duration as they are occasions for genuine creative renewal. But an opportunity, available to the people who will be making the show in its 27th season, to choose what the 30th anniversary of Family Guy will mean. Whether it will be the anniversary of a show that kept going until it couldn't anymore, or the anniversary of a show that found its way back to what made it extraordinary. The version we never got would have been extraordinary all the way through. The version we have, at its best and in its earliest form, was extraordinary too. That extraordinary quality is still there, waiting in the material, waiting in the characters, waiting in the specific kind of comedy that the show was built to produce. Whether it gets recovered or whether it continues to recede is the question that the next chapters of Family Guy's history will answer. For now, tonight, we have been back to the beginning, to the thesis film and the pitch pilot and the character Bible in one man's head, to the version of the Griffins who loved each other more than they could always manage to show, to the Brian who wanted to write something great and couldn't quite finish it, to the Stewie who was genuinely terrifying and genuinely funny because of it, to the show that was made on $50,000 and 6 months of solitude and everything that Seth MacFarlane had been building toward since he was old enough to draw Woody Woodpecker on a piece of paper in Kent, Connecticut, that show is still there. In the early episodes, in the original performances, in the places where the original vision shines through the long history of institutional production, it was always the best version of itself. And knowing that it existed, knowing what it was capable of being, what it was for a few extraordinary seasons, makes the version we never quite got both more visible and more worth remembering. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to Uncle Guy Lore. It means everything to this channel and helps these videos find the people who need them. Sleep well wherever you are. And if you find yourself awake at 3 in the morning unable to sleep, there is always a first season Family Guy episode waiting. The good ones. The ones where you can still feel the original vision breathing inside them. Those will take you somewhere quiet. That is where we started tonight, and that is the best place to end.